Death by Ecstasy. First came the routine request for a breach of privacy permit. A police officer took down the details and forwarded the request to a clerk, who saw that the tape reached the appropriate civic judge. The judge was reluctant, for privacy is a precious thing in a world of 18 billion, but in the end he could find no reason to refuse. On November 2, 2123, he granted the permit. The tenant's rent was 2 weeks in arrears. If the manager of Monica Apartments had asked for eviction, he would have been refused. But Owen Jennison did not answer his doorbell or his room phone. Nobody could recall seeing him in many weeks. Apparently the manager only wanted to know that he was all right. And so he was allowed to use his passkey, with an officer standing by. And so they found the tenant of 1809. And when they had looked in his wallet, they called me. I was at my desk at ARM headquarters making useless notes and wishing it were lunchtime. At this stage the Lauren case was all correlate and wait. It involved an organ-legging gang apparently run by a single man, yet big enough to cover half the North American West Coast. We had considerable data on the gang, methods of operation, centers of activity, a few former customers, even a tentative handful of names, but nothing that would give us an excuse to act. So it was a matter of shoving what we had into the computer, watching the few suspected associates of the gang lord Lauren, and waiting for a break. The months of waiting were ruining my sense of involvement. My phone buzzed. I put the pen down and said, "Gil Hamilton." A small, dark face regarded me with soft, black eyes. "I am Detective Inspector Julio Ordaz of the Los Angeles Police Department. Are you related to an Owen Jennison?" "Owen? No, we're not related. Is he in trouble?" "You do know him, then?" "Sure, I know him. Is he here on Earth?" "It would seem so." Ordaz had no accent, but the lack of colloquialisms in his speech made him sound vaguely foreign. "We will need positive identification, Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Jennison's ident lists you as next of kin." "That's funny. Back up a minute. Is Owen dead?" "Somebody is dead, Mr. Hamilton. He carried Mr. Jennison's ident in his wallet." "Okay. Now, Owen Jennison was a citizen of the Belt. This may have interworld complications. That makes it arms business. Where's the body?" "We found him in an apartment rented under his own name. Monica Apartments, Lower Los Angeles, room 1809. "Good. Don't move anything you haven't moved already. I'll be right over." Monica Apartments was a nearly featureless concrete block, 80 stories tall, 1,000 feet across the edges of its square base. Lines of small balconies gave the sides a sculptured look above a 40-foot inset ledge that would keep tenants from dropping objects on pedestrians. 100 buildings just like it made Lower Los Angeles look lumpy from the air. Inside, a lobby dome in anonymous modern. Lots of metal and plastic showing. Lightweight, comfortable chairs without arms, big ashtrays, plenty of indirect lighting, a low ceiling, no wasted space. The whole room might have been stamped out with a die. It wasn't supposed to look small, but it did, and that warned you what the rooms would be like. You'd pay your rent by the cubic centimeter. I found the manager's office, and the manager, a soft-looking man with watery blue eyes. His conservative paper suit, dark red, seemed chosen to render him invisible, as did the style of his brown hair, worn long and combed straight back without a part. "Nothing like this has ever happened here," he confided as he led me to the elevator banks. "Nothing. It would have been bad enough without his being a belter, but now—" He cringed at the thought. "Newsmen. They'll smother us." The elevator was coffin-sized, but with the handrails on the inside. It went up fast and smooth. I stepped out into a long, narrow hallway. What would Owen have been doing in a place like this? Machinery lived here, not people. Maybe it wasn't Owen. Ordaz had been reluctant to commit himself. Besides, there's no law against picking pockets. You couldn't enforce such a law on this crowded planet. Everyone on Earth was a pickpocket. Sure, someone had died carrying Owen's wallet. I walked down the hallway to 1809. It was Owen who sat grinning in the armchair. I took one good look at him, enough to be sure, and then I looked away and didn't look back. But the rest of it was even more unbelievable. No belter could have taken that apartment. I was born in Kansas, but even I felt the awful anonymous chill. It would have driven Owen bats. "I don't believe it," I said. "Did you know him well, Mr. Hamilton?" "About as well as two men can know each other. He and I spent 3 years mining rocks in the main asteroid belt. You don't keep secrets under those conditions." "Yet you didn't know he was on Earth." "That's what I can't understand. Why the blazes didn't he phone me if he was in trouble?" "You're an arm," said Ordaz. "An operative in the United Nations police." He had a point. Owen was as honorable as any man I knew, but honor isn't the same in the belt. Belters think Flatlanders are all crooks. They don't understand that to a Flatlander, picking pockets is a game of skill. Yet a Belter sees smuggling as the same kind of game, with no dishonesty involved. He balances the 30% tariff against possible confiscation of his cargo, and if the odds are right, he gambles. Owen could have been doing something that would look honest to him, but not to me. "He could have been in something sticky," I admitted. "But I can't see him killing himself over it. And not here. He wouldn't have come here." Room 1809 was a living room and a bathroom and a closet. I'd glanced into the bathroom knowing what I would find. It was the size of a comfortable shower stall. An adjustment panel outside the door would cause it to extrude various appurtenances in memory plastic, to become a washroom, a shower stall, a toilet, a dressing room, a steam cabinet. Luxurious in everything but size, as long as you pushed the right buttons. The living room was more of the same. A king bed was invisible behind a wall. The kitchen alcove, with basin and oven and grill and toaster, would fold into another wall. The sofa, chairs, and tables would vanish into the floor. One tenant and 3 guests would make a crowded cocktail party, a cozy dinner gathering, a closed poker game. Card table, dinner table, coffee table were all there, surrounded by the appropriate chairs, but only one set at a time would emerge from the floor. There was no refrigerator, no freezer, no bar. If a tenant needed food or drink, he phoned down and the supermarket on the 3rd floor would send it up. The tenant of such an apartment had his comfort, but he owned nothing. There was room for him. There was none for his possessions. This was one of the inner apartments. An age ago there would have been an air shaft, but air shafts took up expensive room. The tenant didn't even have a window. He lived in a comfortable box. Just now the items extruded were the overstuffed reading armchair, 2 small side tables, a footstool, and the kitchen alcove. Owen Jennison sat grinning in the armchair. Naturally he grinned. Little more than dried skin covered the natural grin of his skull. "It's a small room," Ordaz said, "but not too small. Millions of people live this way. In any case, a belter would hardly be a claustrophobe." No. Owen flew a single ship before he joined us. 3 months at a stretch in a cabin so small you couldn't stand up with the airlock closed. Not claustrophobia, but... I swept my arm about the room. "What do you see that's his?" Small as it was, the closet was nearly empty. A set of street clothes, a paper shirt, a pair of shoes, a small brown overnight case. All new. The few items in the bathroom medicine chest had been equally new and equally anonymous. Ordaz said, "Well?" "Belters are transients. They don't own much, but what they do own they guard. Small possessions, relics, souvenirs. I can't believe he wouldn't have had something." "His spacesuit?" "You think that's unlikely? It's not. The inside of his pressure suit is a belter's home. Sometimes it's the only home he's got. He spends a fortune decorating it. If he loses his suit, he's not a belter anymore. No, I don't insist he'd have brought his suit, but he'd have had something. His file of Mars dust. The bit of nickel iron they took out of his chest. Or if he left all his souvenirs home, he'd have picked up things on Earth. But in this room, there's nothing." "Perhaps," Ordaz suggested delicately, "he didn't notice his surroundings." And somehow, that brought it all home. Owen Jennison sat grinning in a water-stained silk dressing gown. His space-darkened face lightened abruptly beneath his chin, giving way to normal suntan. His blonde hair, too long, had been cut Earth-style. No trace remained of the belter strip cut he'd worn all his life. A month's growth of untended beard covered half his face. A small black cylinder protruded from the top of his head. An electric cord trailed from the top of the cylinder and ran to a wall socket. The cylinder was a droud, a current addict's transformer. I stepped closer to the corpse and bent to look. The droud was a standard make, but it had been altered. Your standard current addict's droud will pass only a trickle of current into the brain. Owen must have been getting 10 times the usual charge, easily enough to damage his brain in a month's time. I reached out and touched the droud with my imaginary hand. Ordaz was standing quietly beside me, letting me make my examination without interruption. Naturally, he had no way of knowing about my restricted psi powers. With my imaginary fingertips, I touched the droud in Owen's head, then ran them down to a tiny hole in his scalp and farther. It was a standard surgical job. Owen could have had it done anywhere. A hole in his scalp, invisible under the hair, nearly impossible to find even if you knew what you were looking for. Even your best friends wouldn't know unless they caught you with the droud plugged in. But the tiny hole marked a bigger plug, set in the bone of the skull. I touched the Ecstasy plug with my imaginary fingertips, then ran them down the hair-fine wire going deep into Owen's brain, down into the pleasure center. No, the extra current hadn't killed him. What had killed Owen was his lack of willpower. He had been unwilling to get up. He had starved to death sitting in that chair. There were plastic squeeze bottles all around his feet and a couple still on the end tables, all empty. They must have been full a month ago. Owen hadn't died of thirst, he had died of starvation, and his death had been planned. Owen, my crewmate, why hadn't he come to me? I'm half a belter myself. Whatever his trouble, I'd have gotten him out somehow. A little smuggling, what of it? Why had he arranged to tell me only after it was over? The apartment was so clean, so clean. You had to bend close to smell the death. The air conditioning whisked it all away. He'd been very methodical. The kitchen was open so that a catheter could lead from Owen to the sink. He'd given himself enough water to last out the month. He'd paid his rent a month in advance. He'd cut the droud cord by hand, and he'd cut it short, deliberately tethering himself to a wall socket beyond reach of the kitchen. A complex way to die, but rewarding in its way. A month of ecstasy, a month of the highest physical pleasure man can attain. I could imagine him giggling every time he remembered he was starving to death, with food only a few footsteps away. But he'd have to pull out the droud to reach it. Perhaps he had postponed the decision and postponed it again. Owen and I and Homer Chandrasekhar, we had lived for 3 years in a cramped shell surrounded by vacuum. What was there to know about Owen Jennison that I hadn't known? Where was the weakness we didn't share? If Owen had done this, so could I. And I was afraid. Very neat, I whispered. Belter neat. Typically belter, would you say? I would not. Belters don't commit suicide. Certainly not this way. If a belter had to go, he'd blow his ship's drive and die like a star. Well, Ordaz said. Well. He was uncomfortable. The facts spoke for themselves, yet he was reluctant to call me a liar. He fell back on formality. Mr. Hamilton, do you identify this man as Owen Jennison? It's him. He'd always been a touch overweight, yet I'd recognized him the moment I saw him. But let's be sure. I pulled the dirty dressing gown back from Owen's shoulder. A nearly perfect circle of scar tissue 8 inches across spread over the left side of his chest. See that? We noticed it, yes. An old burn? Owen's the only man I know who could show you a meteor scar on his skin. It blasted him in the shoulder one day while he was outside the ship. Sprayed vaporized pressure suit steel all over his skin. The doc pulled a tiny grain of nickel iron from the center of the scar, just below the skin. Owen always carried that grain of nickel iron. Always, I said, looking at Ordaz. We didn't find it. Okay. I'm sorry to put you through this, Mr. Hamilton. It was you who insisted we leave the body in situ. Yes. Thank you. Owen grinned at me from the reading chair. I felt the pain in my throat and in the pit of my stomach. Once I had lost my right arm. Losing Owen felt the same way. I'd like to know more about this, I said. Will you let me know the details as soon as you get them? Of course. Through the arm office? Yes. This wasn't arm business, despite what I'd told Ordaz, but arm prestige would help. I want to know why Owen died. Maybe he just cracked up. Culture shock or something. But if someone hounded him to death, I'll have his blood. Surely the administration of justice is better left to... Ordaz stopped, confused. Did I speak as an arm or as a citizen? I left him wondering. The lobby held a scattering of tenants entering and leaving elevators or just sitting around. I stood outside the elevator for a moment, searching passing faces for the erosion of personality that must be there. Mass-produced comfort. Room to sleep and eat and watch Tri-D, but no room to be anyone. Living here, one would own nothing. What kind of people would live like that? They should have looked all alike, moved in unison like the string of images in a barber's mirrors. Then I spotted wavy brown hair and a dark red paper suit. The manager? I had to get close before I was sure. His face was the face of a permanent stranger. He saw me coming and smiled without enthusiasm. Oh, hello, Mr. Did you find... He couldn't think of the right question. Yes, I said, answering it anyway. But I'd like to know some things. Owen Jennison lived here for 6 weeks, right? 6 weeks and 2 days, before we opened his room. Did he ever have visitors? The man's eyebrows went up. We drifted in the direction of his office, and I was close enough to read the name on the door. Jasper Miller, manager. Of course not, he said. Anyone would have noticed that something was wrong. You mean he took the room for the express purpose of dying? You saw him once and never again? I suppose he might... No, wait. The manager thought deeply. No, he registered on a Thursday. I noticed the belter tan, of course. Then on Friday he went out. I happened to see him pass. Was that the day he got the droud? No, skip it. You wouldn't know that. Was it the last time you saw him go out? Yes, it was. Then he could have had visitors late Thursday or early Friday. The manager shook his head very positively. Why not? You see, Mr. Hamilton. We have a holo camera on every floor, Mr. Hamilton. It takes a picture of each tenant the first time he goes to his room, and then never again. Privacy is one of the services a tenant buys with his room. The manager drew himself up a little as he said this. For the same reason, the holo camera takes a picture of anyone who is not a tenant. The tenants are thus protected from unwarranted intrusions. And there were no visitors to any of the rooms on Owen's floor? No, sir, there were not. Your tenants are a solitary bunch. Perhaps they are. I suppose a computer in the basement decides who is and is not a tenant. Of course. So for 6 weeks, Owen Jennison sat alone in his room. In all that time, he was totally ignored. Miller tried to turn his voice cold, but he was too nervous. We try to give our guests privacy. If Mr. Jennison had wanted help of any kind, he had only to pick up the house phone. He could have called me, or the pharmacy, or the supermarket downstairs. Well, thank you, Mr. Miller. That's all I wanted to know. I wanted to know how Owen Jennison could wait 6 weeks to die while nobody noticed. Miller swallowed. He was dying all that time? Yeah. We had no way of knowing. How could we? I don't see how you can blame us. I don't either, I said, and brushed by. Miller had been close enough, so I had lashed out at him. Now I was ashamed. The man was perfectly right. Owen could have had help if he'd wanted it. I stood outside looking up at the jagged blue line of sky that showed between the tops of the buildings. A taxi floated into view, and I beeped my clicker at it, and it dropped. I went back to ARM headquarters. Not to work. I couldn't have done any work, not under the circumstances, but to talk to Julie. Julie. A tall girl, pushing 30, with green eyes and long hair streaked red and gold, and 2 wide brown forceps marks above her right knee, but they weren't showing now. I looked into her office through the one-way glass and watched her at work. She sat on a contour couch smoking. Her eyes were closed. Sometimes her brow would furrow as she concentrated. Sometimes she would snatch a glance at the clock, then close her eyes again. I didn't interrupt her. I knew the importance of what she was doing. Julie. She wasn't beautiful. Her eyes were a little too far apart, her chin too square, her mouth too wide. It didn't matter, because Julie could read minds. She was the ideal date. She was everything a man needed. A year ago, the day after the night I killed my first man, I had been in a terribly destructive mood. Somehow Julie had turned it into a mood of manic exhilaration. We'd run wild through a supervised anarchy park, running up an enormous bill. We'd hiked 5 miles without going anywhere, facing backward on a downtown slidewalk. At the end, we'd been utterly fatigued, too tired to think. But 2 weeks ago, it had been a warm, cuddly, comfortable night. 2 people happy with each other, no more than that. Julie was what you needed, anytime, anywhere. Her male harem must have been the largest in history. To pick up on the thoughts of a male arm, Julie had to be in love with him. Luckily, there was room in her for a lot of love. She didn't demand that we be faithful. A good half of us were married. But there had to be love for each of Julie's men, or Julie couldn't protect him. She was protecting us now. Each 15 minutes, Julie was making contact with a specific arm agent. Psi powers are notoriously undependable, but Julie was an exception. If we got in a hole, Julie was always there to get us out, provided that some idiot didn't interrupt her at work. So I stood outside, waiting, with a cigarette in my imaginary hand. The cigarette was for practice, to stretch the mental muscles. In its way, my hand was as dependable as Julie's mind touch, possibly because of its very limitations. Doubt your psi powers, and they're gone. A rigidly defined third arm was more reasonable than some warlock ability to make objects move by wishing at them. I knew how an arm felt, and what it would do. Why do I spend so much time lifting cigarettes? Well, it's the biggest weight I can lift without strain. And there's another reason. Something taught me by Owen. At 10 minutes to 15, Julie opened her eyes, rolled out of the contour couch, and came to the door. "Hi, Gil," she said sleepily. "Trouble?" "Yeah. A friend of mine just died. I thought you'd better know." I handed her a cup of coffee. She nodded. We had a date tonight, and this would change its character. Knowing that, she probed lightly. "Jesus," she said, recoiling. How horrible. I'm terribly sorry, Gil. Date's off, right?" "Unless you want to join the ceremonial drunk." She shook her head vigorously. "I didn't know him. It wouldn't be proper. Besides, you'll be wallowing in your own memories, Gil. A lot of them will be private. I'd cramp your style if you knew I was there to probe. Now, if Homer Chandrasekhar were here, it'd be different." "I wish he were. He'll have to throw his own drunk. Maybe with some of Owen's girls, if they're around." "Do you know what I feel?" she said. "Just what I do." "I wish I could help." "You always help." I glanced at the clock. "Your coffee break's about over." "Slave driver." Julie took my earlobe between thumb and forefinger. "Do him proud," she said, and went back to her soundproof room. She always helps. She doesn't even have to speak. Just knowing that Julie has read my thoughts, that someone understands, that's enough. All alone at 3 p.m, I started my ceremonial drunk. The ceremonial drunk is a young custom, not yet tied down by formality. There is no set duration, no specific toasts must be given. Those who participate must be close friends of the deceased, but there is no set number of participants. I started at the luau, a place of cool blue light and running water. Outside it was 15:30 in the afternoon, but inside it was evening in the Hawaiian Islands of centuries ago. Already the place was half full. I picked a corner table with considerable elbow room and dialed for luau grog. It came, cold, brown, and alcoholic, its straw tucked into a cone of ice. There had been 3 of us at Cube's Forsyth ceremonial drunk one Black Series night 4 years ago. A jolly group we were, too, Owen and me and the widow of our 3rd crewman. Gwen Forsyth blamed us for her husband's death. I was just out of the hospital with a right arm that ended at the shoulder, and I blamed Cubes and Owen and myself all at once. Even Owen had turned dour and introspective. We couldn't have picked a worse trio, or a worse night for it. But custom called, and we were there. Then as now, I found myself probing my own personality for the wound that was a missing crewman, a missing friend. Introspecting. Gilbert Hamilton. Born of Flatlander parents in April 2093 in Topeka, Kansas. Born with 2 arms and no sign of wild talents. Flatlander. A belter term referring to Earthmen, particularly to Earthmen who had never seen space. I'm not sure my parents ever looked at the stars. They managed the 3rd largest farm in Kansas, 10 square miles of arable land between 2 wide strips of city, paralleling 2 strips of turnpike. We were city people like all Flatlanders. But when the crowds got to be too much for my brothers and me, we had vast stretches of land to be alone in. 10 square miles of playground, with nothing to hamper us but the crops and auto machinery. We looked at the stars, my brothers and I. You can't see stars from the city. The lights hide them. Even in the fields, you couldn't see them around the lighted horizon. But straight overhead, they were there. Black sky scattered with bright dots and sometimes a flat white moon. At 20, I gave up my UN citizenship to become a belter. I wanted stars, and the Belt government holds title to most of the solar system. There are fabulous riches in the rocks, riches belonging to a scattered civilization of a few 100,000 belters, and I wanted my share of that, too. It wasn't easy. I wouldn't be eligible for a single ship license for 10 years. Meanwhile, I would be working for others and learning to avoid mistakes before they killed me. Half the Flatlanders who join the Belt die in space before they can earn their licenses. I mined tin on Mercury and exotic chemicals from Jupiter's atmosphere. I hauled ice from Saturn's rings and quicksilver from Europa. One year, our pilot made a mistake pulling up to a new rock, and we damn near had to walk home. Cube's Forsyth was with us then. He managed to fix the comm laser and aim it at Icarus to bring us help. Another time, the mechanic who did the maintenance job on our ship forgot to replace an absorber, and we all got roaring drunk on the alcohol that built up in our breathing air. The 3 of us caught the mechanic 6 months later. I hear he lived. Most of the time, I was part of a 3-man crew. The members changed constantly. When Owen Jennison joined us, he replaced a man who had finally earned his single ship license and couldn't wait to start hunting rocks on his own. He was too eager. I learned later that he'd made 1 round trip and half of another. Owen was my age, but more experienced, a belter born and bred. His blue eyes and blonde cockatoo's crest were startling against the dark of his belter tan, the tan that ended so abruptly where his neck ring cut off the space-intense sunlight his helmet let through. He was permanently chubby, but in free fall it was as if he'd been born with wings. I took to copying his way of moving, much to Cubes' amusement. I didn't make my own mistake until I was 26. We were using bombs to put a rock in a new orbit. A contract job. The technique is older than fusion drives, as old as early belt colonization, and it's still cheaper and faster than using a ship's drive to tow the rock. You use industrial fusion bombs, small and clean, and you set them so that each explosion deepens the crater to channel the force of later blasts. We'd set 4 blasts already. 4 white fireballs that swelled and faded as they rose. When the 5th blast went off, we were hovering nearby on the other side of the rock. The 5th blast shattered the rock. Cubes had set the bomb. My own mistake was a shared one because any of the 3 of us should have had the sense to take off right then. Instead, we watched, cursing, as valuable oxygen-bearing rock became nearly valueless shards. We watched the shards spread slowly into a cloud. And while we watched, one fast-moving shard reached us. Moving too slowly to vaporize when it hit, it nonetheless sheared through a triple crystal iron hull, slashed through my upper arm, and pinned Cube's Forsyth to a wall by his heart. A couple of nudists came in. They stood blinking among the booths while their eyes adjusted to the blue twilight, then converged with glad cries on the group 2 tables over. I watched and listened with an eye and an ear, thinking how different Flatlander nudists were from Belter nudists. These all looked alike. They all had muscles, they had no interesting scars, they carried their credit cards in identical shoulder pouches, and they all shaved the same areas. We always went nudist in the big bases. Most people did. It was a natural reaction to the pressure suits we wore day and night while out in the rocks. Get him into a shirt-sleeve environment and your normal belter sneers at a shirt. But it's only for comfort. Give him a good reason and your belter will don shirt and pants as quickly as the next guy. But not Owen. After he got that meteor scar, I never saw him wear a shirt. Not just in the series domes, but anywhere there was air to breathe. He just had to show that scar. A cool blue mood settled on me, and I remembered. Owen Jennison lounging on a corner of my hospital bed, telling me of the trip back. I couldn't remember anything after that rock had sheared through my arm. I should have bled to death in seconds. Owen hadn't given me the chance. The wound was ragged. Owen had sliced it clean to the shoulder with one swipe of a comm laser. Then he'd tied a length of fiberglass curtain over the flat surface and knotted it tight under my remaining armpit. He told me about putting me under 2 atmospheres of pure oxygen as a substitute for replacing the blood I'd lost. He told me how he'd reset the fusion drive for 4 Gs to get me back in time. By rights, we should have gone up in a cloud of starfire and glory.
So there goes my reputation. The whole belt knows how I rewired our drive. A lot of them figure if I'm stupid enough to risk my own life like that, I'd risk theirs too.
So you're not safe to travel with.
Just so. They're starting to call me 4G Jennison.
You think you've got problems? I can just see how it'll be when I get out of this bed. You do something stupid, Gil? The hell of it is, it was stupid.
So lie a little.
Uh-huh. Can we sell the ship?
Nope. Gwen inherited a 3rd interest in it from Cubes. She won't sell.
Then we're effectively broke.
Except for the ship. We need another crewman.
Correction. You need 2 crewmen. Unless you want to fly with a 1-armed man. I can't afford a transplant.
Owen hadn't tried to offer me a loan. That would have been insulting even if he'd had the money. What's wrong with the prosthetic?
An iron arm? Sorry, no. I'm squeamish.
Owen had looked at me strangely, but all he'd said was, "Well, we'll wait a bit. Maybe you'll change your mind."
He hadn't pressured me. Not then and not later, after I'd left the hospital and taken an apartment while I waited to get used to a missing arm. If he thought I would eventually settle for a prosthetic, he was mistaken. Why? It's not a question I can answer. Others obviously feel differently. There are millions of people walking around with metal and plastic and silicone parts. Part man, part machine, and how do they themselves know which is the real person? I'd rather be dead than part metal. Call it a quirk. Call it even the same quirk that makes my skin crawl when I find a place like Monica Apartments. A human being should be all human. He should have habits and possessions peculiarly his own. He should not try to look like or behave like anyone but himself. And he should not be half robot. So there I was, Gil the Arm, learning to eat with my left hand. An amputee never entirely loses what he's lost. My missing fingers itched. I moved to keep from barking my missing elbow on sharp corners. I reached for things, then swore when they didn't come. Owen had hung around, though his own emergency funds must have been running low. I hadn't offered to sell my third of the ship, and he hadn't asked. There had been a girl. Now I'd forgotten her name. One night I had been at her place waiting for her to get dressed, dinner date, and I'd happened to see a nail file she'd left on a table. I'd picked it up. I'd almost tried to file my nails, but remembered in time. Irritated, I had tossed the file back on the table, and missed. Like an idiot, I'd tried to catch it with my right hand. And I'd caught it. I'd never suspected myself of having psychic powers. You have to be in the right frame of mind to use a psi power. But who had ever had a better opportunity than I did that night? With a whole section of brain tuned to the nerves and muscles of my right arm, and no right arm. I'd held the nail file in my imaginary hand. I'd felt it, just as I'd felt my missing fingernails getting too long. I had run my thumb along the rough steel surface. I had turned the file in my fingers. Telekinesis for lift, Esper for touch. "That's it," Owen had said the next day. "That's all we need. One crewman, and you with your eldritch powers. You practice, see how strong you can get that lift. I'll go find a sucker." "He'll have to settle for a sixth of net. Cubes' widow will want her share." "Don't worry, I'll swing it." "Don't worry." I'd waved a pencil stub at him. Even in Ceres' gentle gravity, it was as much as I could lift then. "You don't think TK and Esper can make do for a real arm, do you?" "It's better than a real arm. You'll see. You'll be able to reach through your suit with it without losing pressure. What belter can do that?" "Sure." "What the hell do you want, Gil? Someone should give you your arm back? You can't have that. You lost it fair and square, through stupidity. Now it's your choice. Do you fly with an imaginary arm, or do you go back to Earth?" "I can't go back. I don't have the fare." "Well?" Okay, go find us a crewman. Someone I can impress with my imaginary arm." I sucked meditatively on a second luau grog. By now all the booths were full, and a second layer was forming around the bar. The voices made a continuous hypnotic roar. Cocktail hour had arrived. He'd swung it all right. On the strength of my imaginary arm, Owen had talked a kid named Homer Chandrasekhar into joining our crew. He'd been right about my arm, too. Others with similar senses can reach farther, up to halfway around the world. My unfortunately literal imagination had restricted me to a psychic hand. But my Esper fingertips were more sensitive, more dependable. I could lift more weight. Today, in Earth's gravity, I can lift a full shot glass. I found I could reach through a cabin wall to feel for breaks in the circuits behind it. In vacuum, I could brush dust from the outside of my faceplate. In port, I did magic tricks. I'd almost ceased to feel like a cripple. It was all due to Owen. In 6 months of mining, I had paid off my hospital bills and earned my fare back to Earth, with a comfortable stake left over. "Finagle's black humor," Owen had exploded when I had told him. "Of all places, why Earth?" "Because if I can get my UN citizenship back, Earth will replace my arm, free." "Oh, that's true," he'd said dubiously. The Belt had organ banks too, but they were always undersupplied. Belters didn't give things away. Neither did the Belt government. They kept the prices on transplants as high as they would go. Thus they dropped the demand to meet the supply, and kept taxes down to boot. In the Belt, I'd have to buy my own arm, and I didn't have the money. On Earth, there was Social Security and a vast supply of transplant material. What Owen had said couldn't be done, I'd done. I'd found someone to hand me my arm back. Sometimes I'd wondered if Owen held the choice against me. He'd never said anything, but Homer Chandrasekhar had spoken at length. A Belter would have earned his arm or done without. Never would he have accepted charity. Was that why Owen hadn't tried to call me? I shook my head. I didn't believe it. The room continued to lurch after my head stopped shaking. I'd had enough for the moment. I finished my third grog and ordered dinner. Dinner sobered me for the next lap. It was something of a shock to realize that I'd run through the entire lifespan of my friendship with Owen Jennison. I'd known him for 3 years, though it had seemed like half a lifetime. And it was. Half my 6-year lifespan as a Belter. I ordered coffee grog and watched the man pour it. Hot, milky coffee laced with cinnamon and other spices, and high-proof rum poured in a stream of blue fire. This was one of the special drinks served by a human headwaiter, and it was the reason they kept him around. Phase 2 of the ceremonial drunk. Blow half your fortune in the grand manner. But I called Ordaz before I touched the drink.
Yes, Mr. Hamilton. I was just going home for dinner.
I won't keep you long. Have you found out anything new?
Ordaz took a closer look at my phone image.
His disapproval was plain.
I see that you have been drinking. Perhaps you should go home now and call me tomorrow.
I was shocked. Don't you know anything about Belt customs?
I do not understand.
I explained the ceremonial drunk. Look, Ordaz, if you know that little about the way a Belter thinks, then we'd better have a talk, soon. Otherwise, you're likely to miss something.
You may be right. I can see you at noon, over lunch.
Good. What have you got?
Considerable, but none of it is very helpful. Your friend landed on Earth 2 months ago, arriving on the Pillar of Fire, operating out of Outback Field, Australia. He was wearing a haircut in the style of Earth. From there...
That's funny. He'd have had to wait 2 months for his hair to grow out.
That occurred even to me. I understand that a Belter commonly shaves his entire scalp, except for a strip 2 inches wide running from the nape of his neck forward.
The strip cut, yeah. It probably started when someone decided he'd live longer if his hair couldn't fall in his eyes during a tricky landing. But Owen could have let his hair grow out during a single-ship mining trip. There'd be nobody to see.
Still, it seems odd. Did you know that Mr. Jennison has a cousin on Earth? One Harvey Peel, who manages a chain of supermarkets.
So I wasn't his next of kin, even on Earth.
Mr. Jennison made no attempt to contact him.
Anything else?
I've spoken to the man who sold Mr. Jennison his droud and plug. Kenneth Graham owns an office and operating room on Galion near West Los Angeles. Graham claims that the droud was a standard type, that your friend must have altered it himself.
Do you believe him?
For the present. His permits and his records are all in order. The droud was altered with a soldering iron, an amateur's tool.
Uh-huh.
As far as the police are concerned, the case will probably be closed when we locate the tools Mr. Jennison used.
Tell you what, I'll wire Homer Chandrasekhar tomorrow. Maybe he can find out things. Why Owen landed without a strip haircut, why he came to Earth at all.
Ordaz shrugged with his eyebrows.
He thanked me for my trouble and hung up. The coffee grog was still hot. I gulped at it, savoring the sugary, bitter sting of it, trying to forget Owen dead and remember him in life. He was always slightly chubby, I remembered, but he never gained a pound and never lost a pound. He could move like a whippet when he had to. And now he was terribly thin, and his death grin was ripe with obscene joy. I ordered another coffee grog. The waiter, a showman, made sure he had my attention before he lit the heated rum, then poured it from a foot above the glass. You can't drink that drink slowly. It slides down too easily, and there's the added spur that if you wait too long it might get cold. Rum and strong coffee. 2 of these and I'd be drunkenly alert for hours. Midnight found me in the Mars bar, running on scotch and soda. In between, I'd been bar hopping. Irish coffee at Bergen's, cold and smoking concoctions at the Moon Pool, scotch and wild music at Beyond. I couldn't get drunk, and I couldn't find the right mood. There was a barrier to the picture I was trying to rebuild. It was the memory of the last Owen, grinning in an armchair with a wire leading down into his brain. I didn't know that Owen. I had never met the man, and never would have wanted to. From bar to nightclub to restaurant, I had run from the image, waiting for the alcohol to break the barrier between present and past. So I sat at a corner table, surrounded by 3D panoramic views of an impossible Mars. Crystal towers and long, straight blue canali, 6-legged beasts and beautiful, impossibly slender men and women looking out at me across Never Never Land. Would Owen have found it sad or funny? He'd seen the real Mars and had not been impressed. I had reached that stage where time becomes discontinuous, where gaps of seconds or minutes appear between the events you can remember. Somewhere in that period, I found myself staring at a cigarette. I must have just lighted it because it was near its original 200mm length. Maybe a waiter had snuck up behind me. There it was, at any rate, burning between my middle and index fingers. I stared at the coal as the mood settled on me. I was calm. I was drifting. I was lost in time. We'd been 2 months in the rocks, our first trip out since the accident. Back we came to Ceres with a hold full of gold, 50% pure, guaranteed suitable for rust-proof wiring and conductor plates. At nightfall, we were ready to celebrate. We walked along the city limits with neon blinking and beckoning on the right, a melted rock cliff to the left, and stars blazing through the dome overhead. Homer Chandrasekhar was practically snorting. On this night, his first trip out culminated in his first homecoming, and homecoming is the best part.
"We'll want to split up about midnight," he said.
He didn't need to enlarge on that. 3 men in company might conceivably be 3 single-ship pilots, but chances are they're a ship's crew. They don't have their single-ship licenses yet. They're too stupid or too inexperienced. If we wanted companions for the night.
"You haven't thought this through,"
Owen answered. I saw Homer's double take, then his quick look at where my shoulder ended, and I was ashamed. I didn't need my crewmates to hold my hand, and in this state I'd only slow them down. Before I could open my mouth to protest, Owen went on.
"We've got a draw here that we'd be idiots to throw away. Gil, pick up a cigarette. No, not with your left hand."
I was drunk, gloriously drunk and feeling immortal. The attenuated Martian seemed to move in the walls that seemed to be picture windows on a Mars that never was. For the first time that night, I raised my glass in a toast. To Owen, from Gil the Arm. Thanks. I transferred the cigarette to my imaginary hand. By now you've got the idea I was holding it in my imaginary fingers. Most people have the same impression, but it isn't so. I held it clutched ignominiously in my fist. The coal couldn't burn me, of course, but it still felt like a lead ingot. I rested my imaginary elbow on the table, and that seemed to make it easier. Which is ridiculous, but it works. Truly, I'd expected my imaginary arm to disappear after I got the transplant. But I'd found I could dissociate from the new arm to hold small objects in my invisible hand, to feel tactile sensations in my invisible fingertips. I'd earned the title Gil the Arm that night in Ceres. It had started with a floating cigarette. Owen had been right. Everyone in the place eventually wound up staring at the floating cigarette smoked by the one-armed man. All I had to do was find the prettiest girl in the room with my peripheral vision, then catch her eye. That night we had been the center of the biggest impromptu party ever thrown in series base. It wasn't planned that way at all. I'd used the cigarette trick 3 times so that each of us would have a date. But the third girl already had an escort, and he was celebrating something. He'd sold some kind of patent to an Earth-based industrial firm. He was throwing money around like confetti. So we let him stay. I did tricks, reaching Esper fingers into a closed box to tell what was inside, and by the time I finished, all the tables had been pushed together, and I was in the center, with Homer and Owen and 3 girls. Then we got to singing old songs, and the bartenders joined us, and suddenly everything was on the house. Eventually, about 20 of us wound up in the orbiting mansion of the first speaker for the Belt government. The Goldskin cops had tried to bust us up earlier, and the first speaker had behaved very rudely indeed, then compensated by inviting them to join us. And that was why I used TK on so many cigarettes. Across the width of the Mars bar, a girl in a peach-colored dress sat studying me with her chin on her fist. I got up and went over. My head felt fine. It was the first thing I checked when I woke up. Apparently, I'd remembered to take a hangover pill. A leg was hooked over my knee. It felt good, though the pressure had put my foot to sleep. Fragrant dark hair spilled beneath my nose. I didn't move. I didn't want her to know I was awake. It's damned embarrassing when you wake up with a girl and can't remember her name. Well, let's see. A peach dress neatly hung from a doorknob. I remembered a whole lot of traveling last night. The girl at the Mars bar, a puppet show, music of all kinds. I'd talked about Owen, and she'd steered me away from that because it depressed her. Then, Taffy. Last name forgotten. "Morning," I said. "Morning," she said. "Don't try to move. We're hooked together." In the sober morning light, she was lovely. Long black hair, brown eyes, creamy untanned skin. To be lovely this early was a neat trick, and I told her so, and she smiled. My lower leg was dead meat until it started to buzz with renewed circulation, and then I made faces until it calmed down. Taffy kept up a running chatter as we dressed. "That third hand is strange. I remember you holding me with 2 strong arms and stroking the back of my neck with the third. Very nice. It reminded me of a Fritz Leiber story." "The Wanderer. The Panther Girl." "Mm-hmm. How many girls have you caught with that cigarette trick?" "None as pretty as you." "And how many girls have you told that to?" "Can't remember. It always worked before. Maybe this time it's for real." We exchanged grins. A minute later, I caught her frowning thoughtfully at the back of my neck. "Something wrong?" "I was just thinking. You really crashed and burned last night. I hope you don't drink that much all the time." "Why? You worried about me?" She blushed, then nodded. "I should have told you. In fact, I think I did last night. When a good friend dies, it's obligatory to get smashed." Taffy looked relieved. "I didn't mean to get—" "Personal? Why not? You've got the right. Anyway, I like maternal types, but I couldn't say that. People who worry about me." Taffy touched her hair with some kind of complex comb. A few strokes snapped her hair instantly into place. Static electricity? "It was a good drunk," I said. "Owen would have been proud. And that's all the morning I'll do. 1 drunk and—" I spread my hands. "Out." "It's not a bad way to go," Taffy mused reflectively. "Current stimulus, I mean. If you've got to bow out." "Now drop that." I don't know how I got so angry so fast. Ghoul-thin and grinning in a reading chair, Owen's corpse was suddenly vivid before me. I'd fought that image for too many hours. Walking off a bridge is enough of a cop-out, I snarled. Dying for a month while current burns out your brain is nothing less than sickening. Taffy was hurt and bewildered.
But your friend did it, didn't he? You didn't make him sound like a weakling.
Nuts, I heard myself say. He didn't do it. He was...
Just like that, I was sure. I must have realized it while I was drunk or sleeping. Of course he hadn't killed himself. That wasn't Owen. And current addiction wasn't Owen either.
He was murdered, I said.
Sure he was. Why didn't I see it?
And I made a dive for the phone.
Good morning, Mr. Hamilton.
Detective Inspector Ordaz looked very fresh and neat this morning. I was suddenly aware that I hadn't shaved.
I see you remembered to take your hangover pills.
Right. Ordaz, has it occurred to you that Owen might have been murdered?
Naturally, but it isn't possible.
I think it might be.
Suppose he... Mr. Hamilton.
Yeah?
We have an appointment for lunch. Shall we discuss it then? Meet me at headquarters at 1200.
Okay. One thing you might take care of this morning. See if Owen registered for a nudist license.
Do you think he might have?
Yeah. I'll tell you why at lunch.
Very well.
Don't hang up. You said you'd found the man who sold Owen his droud and plug. What was his name again?
Kenneth Graham.
That's what I thought. I hung up. Taffy touched my shoulder.
Do you really think he might have been killed?
Yeah. The whole setup depended on him not being able to...
No. Wait. I don't want to know about it.
I turned to look at her. She really didn't. The very subject of a stranger's death was making her sick to her stomach. Okay. Look, I'm a jerk not to at least offer you breakfast, but I've got to get on this right away. Can I call you a cab? When the cab came, I dropped a 10-mark coin in the slot and helped her in. I got her address before it took off. ARM headquarters hummed with early morning activity. Hellos came my way, and I answered them without stopping to talk. Anything important would filter down to me eventually. As I passed Julie's cubicle, I glanced in. She was hard at work, limply settled in her contour couch, jotting notes with her eyes closed. Kenneth Graham. A hookup to the basement computer formed the greater part of my desk. Learning how to use it had taken me several months. I typed an order for coffee and donuts, then information retrieval, Kenneth Graham, limited license, surgery, general license, direct current stimulus equipment sales, address, near West Los Angeles. Tape chattered out of the slot, an instant response, loop after loop of it curling on my desk. I didn't need to read it to know I was right. New technologies create new customs, new laws, new ethics, new crimes. About half the activity of the United Nations Police, the arms, dealt with control of a crime that hadn't existed a century ago. The crime of organ legging was the result of thousands of years of medical progress, of millions of lives selflessly dedicated to the ideal of healing the sick. Progress had brought these ideals to reality, and as usual, had created new problems. 1900 AD was the year Karl Landsteiner classified human blood into 4 types, giving patients their first real chance to survive a transfusion. The technology of transplants had grown with the growing of the 20th century. Whole blood, dry bone, skin, live kidneys, live hearts could all be transferred from one body to another. Donors had saved tens of thousands of lives in that 100 years by willing their bodies to medicine. But the number of donors was limited, and not many died in such a way that anything of value could be saved. The deluge had come something less than 100 years ago. One healthy donor, but of course there was no such animal, could save a dozen lives. Why then should a condemned murderer die for no purpose? First a few states, then most of the nations of the world had passed new laws. Criminals condemned to death must be executed in a hospital, with surgeons to save as much as could be saved for the organ banks. The world's billions wanted to live, and the organ banks were life itself. A man could live forever, as long as the doctors could shove spare parts into him faster than his own parts wore out. But they could do that only as long as the world's organ banks were stocked. 100 scattered movements to abolish the death penalty died silent, unpublicized deaths. Everybody gets sick sometime. And still there were shortages in the organ banks. Still patients died for the lack of parts to save them. The world's legislators had responded to steady pressure from the world's people. Death penalties were established for first, second, and third-degree murder, for assault with a deadly weapon, then for a multitude of crimes: rape, fraud, embezzlement, having children without a license, 4 or more counts of false advertising. For nearly a century, the trend had been growing as the world's voting citizens acted to protect their rights to live forever. Even now, there weren't enough transplants. A woman with kidney trouble might wait a year for a transplant. 1 healthy kidney to last the rest of her life. A 35-year-old heart patient must live with a sound but 40-year-old heart. 1 lung, part of a liver, prosthetics that wore out too fast or weighed too much or did too little. There weren't enough criminals. Not surprisingly, the death penalty was a deterrent. People stopped committing crimes rather than face the donor room of a hospital. For instant replacement of your ruined digestive system, for a young, healthy heart, for a whole liver when you'd ruined yours with alcohol, you had to go to an organ legger. There are 3 aspects to the business of organ legging. 1 is the business of kidnap murder. It's risky. You can't fill an organ bank by waiting for volunteers. Executing condemned criminals is a government monopoly. So you go out and get your donors. On a crowded city slidewalk, in an air terminal, stranded on a freeway by a car with a busted capacitor. Anywhere. The selling end of the business is just as dangerous because even a desperately sick man sometimes has a conscience. He'll buy his transplant, then go straight to the arms, curing his sickness and his conscience by turning in the whole gang. Thus the sales end is somewhat anonymous, but as there are few repeat sales, that hardly matters. Third is the technical, medical aspect. Probably this is the safest part of the business. Your hospital is big, but you can put it anywhere. You wait for the donors, who arrive still alive. You ship out livers and glands and square feet of live skin, correctly labeled for rejection reactions. It's not as easy as it sounds. You need doctors. Good ones. That was where Loren came in. He had a monopoly. Where did he get them? We were still trying to find out. Somehow one man had discovered a foolproof way to recruit talented but dishonest doctors practically en masse. Was it really one man? All our sources said it was. And he had half the North American West Coast in the palm of his hand. Loren. No holographs, no fingerprints or retina prints, not even a description. All we had was that one name, and a few possible contacts. One of those was Kenneth Graham. The hologram was a good one. Probably it had been posed in a portrait shop. Kenneth Graham had a long, Scottish face with a lantern jaw and a small, dour mouth. In the holo he was trying to smile and look dignified simultaneously. He only looked uncomfortable. His hair was sandy and close cut. Above his light gray eyes, his eyebrows were so light as to be nearly invisible. My breakfast arrived. I dunked a donut and bit it and found out I was hungrier than I'd thought. A string of holos had been reproduced on the computer tape. I ran through the others fairly quickly, eating with one hand and flipping the key with the other. Some were fuzzy. They had been taken by spy beams through the windows of Graham's shop. None of the prints were in any way incriminating. Not one showed Graham smiling. He had been selling electrical joy for 12 years now. A current addict has an advantage over his supplier. Electricity is cheap. With a drug, your supplier can always raise the price on you, but not with electricity. You see the ecstasy merchant once when he sells you your operation and your droud, and never again. Nobody gets hooked by accident. There's an honesty to current addiction. The customer always knows just what he's getting into and what it will do for him and to him. Still, you'd need a certain lack of empathy to make a living the way Kenneth Graham did. Else he'd have had to turn away his customers. Nobody becomes a current addict gradually. He decides all at once, and he buys the operation before he has ever tasted its joy. Each of Kenneth Graham's customers had reached his shop after deciding to drop out of the human race. What a stream of the hopeless and the desperate must have passed through Graham's shop. How could they help but haunt his dreams? And if Kenneth Graham slept well at night, then small wonder if he had turned organ-legger. He was in a good position for it. Despair is characteristic of the would-be current addict. The unknown, the unloved, the people nobody knew and nobody needed and nobody missed. These passed in a steady stream through Kenneth Graham's shop. So a few didn't come out. Who'd notice? I flipped quickly through the tape to find out who was in charge of watching Graham. Jackson Barra. I called down through the desk phone. "Sure," Barra said. "We've had a spy beam on him about 3 weeks now. It's a waste of good salaried arm agents. Maybe he's clean. Maybe he's been tipped somehow. Then why not stop watching him?" Barra looked disgusted. "Because we've only been watching for 3 weeks. How many donors do you think he needs a year? Read the reports. Gross profit on a single donor is over 1 million UN marks. Graham can afford to be careful who he picks." "Yeah. At that, he wasn't careful enough. At least 2 of his customers disappeared last year. Customers with families. That's what put us on to him." "So you could watch him for the next 6 months without a guarantee. He could be just waiting for the right guy to walk in." "Sure. He has to write up a report on every customer. That gives him the right to ask personal questions. If the guy has relatives, Graham lets him walk out. Most people do have relatives, you know. Then again," Barra said disconsolately, "he could be clean. Sometimes a current addict disappears without help." "How come I didn't see any hollows of Graham at home? You can't be watching just his shop." Jackson Barra scratched at his hair like black steel wool, worn long like a bushman's mop. "Sure, we're watching his place, but we can't get a spy beam in there. It's an inside apartment, no windows. You know anything about spy beams?" "Not much. I know they've been around a while." "They're as old as lasers. Oldest trick in the book is to put a mirror in the room you want to bug. Then you run a laser beam through a window, or even through heavy drapes, and bounce it off the mirror. When you pick it up, it's been distorted by the vibrations in the glass. That gives you a perfect recording of anything that's been said in that room. But for pictures, you need something a little more sophisticated." "How sophisticated can we get?" "We can put a spy beam in any room with a window. We can send one through some kinds of wall. Give us an optically flat surface, and we can send one around corners." "But you need an outside wall." "Yep." "What's Graham doing now?" "Just a sec." Barra disappeared from view. "Someone just came in. Graham's talking to him. Want the picture?" "Sure. Leave it on. I'll turn it off from here when I'm through with it." The picture of Barra went dark. A moment later, I was looking into a doctor's office. If I'd seen it cold, I'd have thought it was run by a podiatrist. There was the comfortable, tilt-back chair with the headrest and the footrest, the cabinet next to it with instruments lying on top on a clean white cloth, the desk over in one corner. Kenneth Graham was talking to a homely, washed-out-looking girl. I listened to Graham's would-be fatherly reassurances and his glowing description of the magic of current addiction. When I couldn't take it any longer, I turned the sound down. The girl took her place in the chair, and Graham placed something over her head. The girl's homely face turned suddenly beautiful. Happiness is beautiful all by itself. A happy person is beautiful per se. Suddenly and totally, the girl was full of joy. And I realized that I hadn't known everything about droud sales. Apparently, Graham had an inductor to put the current where he wanted it, without wires. He could show a customer what current addiction felt like, without first implanting the wires. What a powerful argument that was. Graham turned off the machine. It was as if he'd turned off the girl. She sat stunned for a moment, then reached frantically for her purse and started scrabbling inside. I couldn't take any more. I turned it off. Small wonder if Graham had turned organ legger. He had to be totally without empathy just to sell his merchandise. Even there, I thought, he'd had a head start. So he was a little more callous than the rest of the world's billions, but not much. Every voter had a bit of the organ legger in him. In voting the death penalty for so many crimes, the lawmakers had only bent to pressure from the voters. There was a spreading lack of respect for life, the evil side of transplant technology. The good side was a longer life for everyone. One condemned criminal could save a dozen deserving lives. Who could complain about that? We hadn't thought that way in the Belt. In the Belt, survival was a virtue in itself, and life was a precious thing, spread so thin among the sterile rocks, hurtling in single units through all that killing emptiness between the worlds. So I'd had to come to Earth for my transplant. My request had been accepted 2 months after I had landed. So quickly? Later I'd learned that the banks always have a surplus of certain items. Few people lose their arms these days. I had also learned a year after the transplant had taken that I was using an arm taken from a captured organ legger's storage bank. That had been a shock. I'd hoped my arm had come from a depraved murderer, someone who'd shot 14 nurses from a rooftop. Not at all. Some faceless, nameless victim had had the bad luck to encounter a ghoul, and I had benefited thereby. Did I turn in my new arm in a fit of revulsion? No, surprising to say, I did not. But I had joined the arms, once the amalgamation of regional militia, now the United Nations Police. Though I had stolen a dead man's arm, I would hunt the kin of those who had killed him. The noble urgency of that resolve had been drowned in paperwork these last few years. Perhaps I was becoming callous, like the Flatlanders, the other Flatlanders around me, voting new death penalties year after year, income tax evasion, operating a flying vehicle on manual controls over a city. Was Kenneth Graham so much worse than they? Sure he was. The bastard had put a wire in Owen Jennison's head. I waited 20 minutes for Julie to come out. I could have sent her a memorandum, but there was plenty of time before noon and too little time to get anything accomplished, and I wanted to talk to her. "Hi," she said. "Thanks," taking the coffee. "How went the ceremonial drunk?" "Oh, I see. Very good. Almost poetic." Conversation with Julie has a way of taking shortcuts. Poetic, right. I remembered how inspiration had struck like lightning through a mild high glow. Owen's floating cigarette lure. What better way to honor his memory than to use it to pick up a girl? "Right," Julie agreed. "But there's something you may have missed. What's Taffy's last name?" "I can't remember. She wrote it down on—" "What does she do for a living?" "How should I know?" "What religion is she? Is she a pro or an anti? Where did she grow up?" "Damn it. Half an hour ago you were very complacently musing on how depersonalized all us Flatlanders are except you. What's Taffy? A person or a foldout?" Julie stood with her hands on her hips, looking up at me like a schoolteacher. How many people is Julie? Some of us have never seen this guardian aspect. She's frightening, the guardian. If it ever appeared on a date, the man she was with would be struck impotent forever. It never does. When a reprimand is deserved, Julie delivers it in broad daylight. This serves to separate her functions. but it doesn't make it easier to take. No use pretending it wasn't her business, either. I'd come here to ask for Julie's protection. Let me turn unlovable to Julie, even a little bit unlovable, and as far as Julie was concerned, I would have an unreadable mind. How then would she know when I was in trouble? How could she send help to rescue me from whatever? My private life was her business, her single, vastly important job. I liked Taffy, I protested. I didn't care who she was when we met. Now I like her, and I think she likes me. What do you want from a first date? You know better. You can remember other dates when two of you talked all night on a couch just from the joy of learning about each other. She mentioned 3 names, and I flushed. Julie knows the words that will turn you inside out in an instant. Taffy is a person, not an episode, not a symbol of anything, not just a pleasant night. What's your judgment of her? I thought about it, standing there in the corridor. Funny. I've faced the guardian Julie on other occasions, and it has never occurred to me to just walk out of the unpleasant situation. Later I think of that. At the time, I just stand there, facing the guardian, judge, teacher. I thought about Taffy. She's nice, I said. Not depersonalized. Squeamish, even. She wouldn't make a good nurse. She'd want to help too much, and it would tear her apart when she couldn't. I'd say she was one of the vulnerable ones. Go on. I want to see her again, but I won't dare talk shop with her. In fact, I better not see her till this business of Owen is over. Lauren might take an interest in her, or she might take an interest in me, and I might get hurt. Have I missed anything? I think so. You owe her a phone call. If you won't be dating her for a few days, call her and tell her so. Check. I spun on my heel, spun back. Finagle's jest, I almost forgot. The reason I came here, I know. You want a time slot. Suppose I check on you at 09:45 every morning. That's a little early. When I get in deadly danger, it's usually at night. I'm off at night. 09:45 is all I've got. I'm sorry, Gil, but it is. Shall I monitor you or not? Sold. 9:45. Good. Let me know if you get real proof Owen was murdered. I'll give you 2 slots. You'll be in a little more concrete danger then. Good. Taffy wasn't home, of course, and I didn't know where she worked or even what she did. Her phone offered to take a message. I gave my name and said I'd call back. And then I sat there sweating for 5 minutes. It was half an hour to noon. Here I was at my desk phone. I couldn't decently see any way to argue myself out of sending a message to Homer Chandrasekhar. I didn't want to talk to him, then or ever. He'd chewed me out but good last time I'd seen him. My free arm had cost me my belter life, and it had cost me Homer's respect. I didn't want to talk to him even on a one-way message, and I most particularly didn't want to have to tell him Owen was dead. But someone had to tell him. And maybe he could find out something. And I'd put it off nearly a full day. For 5 minutes I sweated, and then I called long distance and recorded a message and sent it off to Ceres. More accurately, I recorded 6 messages before I was satisfied. I don't want to talk about it. I tried Taffy again. She might come home for lunch. Wrong. I hung up, wondering if Julie had been fair. What had we bargained for, Taffy and I, beyond a pleasant night? And we'd had that, and would have others with luck. But Julie would find it hard not to be fair. If she thought Taffy was the vulnerable type, she'd taken her information from my own mind. Mixed feelings. You're a kid, and your mother has just laid down the law. But it is a law, something you can count on. And she is paying attention to you. And she does care. When, for so many of those outside, nobody cares at all. Naturally, I thought of murder, Ordaz said. I always consider murder. When my sainted mother passed away after 3 years of the most tender care by my sister Maria Angela,
I actually considered searching for evidence of needle holes about the head.
Find any?
Ordaz's face froze. He put down his beer and started to get up.
Cool it, I said hurriedly. No offense intended.
He glared a moment, then sat down half-mollified.
We'd picked an outdoor restaurant on the pedestrian level. On the other side of a hedge, a real live hedge, green and growing and everything, the shoppers were carried past in a steady one-way stream. Beyond them, a slidewalk carried a similar stream in the opposite direction. I had the dizzy feeling that it was we who were moving. A waiter, like a bell-bottomed chess pawn, produced steaming dishes of chili from its torso, put them precisely in front of us, and slid away on a cushion of air.
Naturally, I considered murder. Believe me, Mr. Hamilton, it does not hold up.
I think I could make a pretty good case.
You may try, of course.
Better, I will start you on your way.
First, we must assume that Kenneth Graham, the happiness peddler, did not sell a droud and plug to Owen Jennison. Rather, Owen Jennison was forced to undergo the operation. Graham's records, including the written permission to operate, were forged. All this we must assume, is it not so?
Right. And before you tell me Graham's escutcheon is unblemished, let me tell you that it isn't.
Oh?
He's connected with an organ-legging gang. That's classified information. We're watching him, and we don't want him tipped.
That is news.
Ordaz rubbed his jaw.
Organ-legging. Well, what would Owen Jennison have to do with organ-legging?
Owen's a belter. The belt's always drastically short of transplant materials.
Yes, they import quantities of medical supplies from Earth. Not only organs in storage, but also drugs and prosthetics. So?
Owen ran a good many cargoes past the gold skins in his day. He got caught a few times, but he's still way ahead of the government. He's on the records as a successful smuggler. If a big organ-legger wanted to expand his market, he might very well send a feeler out to a belter with a successful smuggling record.
You never mentioned that Mr. Jennison was a smuggler.
What for? All belters are smugglers if they think they can get away with it. To a belter, smuggling isn't immoral. But an organ-legger wouldn't know that. He'd think Owen was already a criminal.
Do you think your friend...
Ordaz hesitated delicately. No. Owen wouldn't turn organ-legger. But he just might try to turn one in. The rewards for information leading to the capture and conviction of etc. are substantial. If someone contacted Owen, Owen might very well have tried to trace the contact by himself. Now, the gang we're after covers half the west coast of this continent. That's big. It's the Lauren gang, the one Graham may be working for. Suppose Owen had a chance to meet Lauren himself.
You think he might take it, do you?
I think he did. I think he let his hair grow out so he'd look like an Earthman to convince Lauren he wanted to look inconspicuous. I think he collected as much information as he could, then tried to get out with a whole skin. But he didn't make it. Did you find his application for a nudist license?
No. I saw your point there, said Ordaz.
He leaned back, ignoring the food in front of him.
Mr. Jennison's tan was uniform except for the characteristic darkening of the face. I presume he was a practicing nudist in the belt.
Yeah, we don't need licenses there. He'd have been one here, too, unless he was hiding something. Remember that scar? He never missed a chance to show it off.
Could he really have thought to pass for a...
Ordaz hesitated.
Flatlander?
With that belter tan? No. He was overdoing it a little with the haircut. Maybe he thought Lauren would underestimate him. But he wasn't advertising his presence, or he wouldn't have left his most personal possessions home.
So, he was dealing with organ-leggers, and they found him out before he could reach you. Yes, Mr. Hamilton, this is well thought out, but it won't work.
Why not? I'm not trying to prove it's murder, not yet. I'm just trying to show you that murder is at least as likely as suicide.
But it's not, Mr. Hamilton.
I looked the question.
Consider the details of the hypothetical murder. Owen Jennison is drugged, no doubt, and taken to the office of Kenneth Graham. There, an ecstasy plug is attached. A standard droud is fitted, and is then amateurishly altered with soldering tools. Already we see, on the part of the killer, a minute attention to details. We see it again in Kenneth Graham's forged papers of permission to operate. They were impeccable. Owen Jennison is then taken back to his apartment. It would be his own, would it not? There would be little point in moving him to another. The cord from his droud is shortened, again in amateurish fashion. Mr. Jennison is tied up.
I wondered if you'd see that.
But why should he not be tied up? He is tied up and allowed to waken. Perhaps the arrangement is explained to him, perhaps not. That would be up to the killer. The killer then plugs Mr. Jennison into a wall. A current trickles through his brain, and Owen Jennison knows pure pleasure for the first time in his life. He is left tied up for, let us say, 3 hours. In the first few minutes, he would be a hopeless addict, I think.
You must have known more current addicts than I have.
Even I would not want to be pinned down. Your normal current addict is an addict after a few minutes. But then your normal current addict asked to be made an addict, knowing what it would do to his life. Current addiction is symptomatic of despair. Your friend might have been able to fight free of a few minutes' exposure.
So they kept him tied up for 3 hours. Then they cut the ropes. I felt sickened. Ordaz's ugly, ugly pictures matched mine in every detail.
No more than 3 hours by our hypothesis. They would not dare stay longer than a few hours. They would cut the ropes and leave Owen Jennison to starve to death. In the space of a month, the evidence of his drugging would vanish, as would any abrasions left by ropes, lumps on his head, mercy needle punctures, and the like. A carefully detailed, well-thought-out plan, don't you agree?
I told myself that Ordaz was not being ghoulish, he was just doing his job. Still, it was difficult to answer objectively. It fits our picture of Lauren. He's been very careful with us. He'd love carefully detailed, well-thought-out plans.
Ordaz leaned forward. But don't you see? A carefully detailed plan is all wrong. There is a crucial flaw in it. Suppose Mr. Jennison pulls out the droud.
Could he do that? Would he?
Could he? Certainly. A simple tug of the fingers. The current wouldn't interfere with motor coordination. Would he?
Ordaz pulled meditatively at his beer.
I know a good deal about current addiction, but I don't know what it feels like, Mr. Hamilton. Your normal addict pulls his droud out as often as he inserts it. But your friend was getting 10 times normal current. He might have pulled the droud out a dozen times, and instantly plugged it back each time. Yet belters are supposed to be strong-willed men, very individualistic. Who knows whether, even after a week of addiction, your friend might not have pulled the droud loose, coiled the cord, slipped it in his pocket, and walked away scot-free. There is the additional risk that someone might walk in on him, an automachinery serviceman, for instance. Or someone might notice that he had not bought any food in a month. A suicide would take that risk. Suicides routinely leave themselves a chance to change their minds. But a murderer? No. Even if the chance were 1 in 1,000, the man who created such a detailed plan would never have taken such a chance.
The sun burned hotly down on our shoulders. Ordaz suddenly remembered his lunch and began to eat. I watched the world ride by beyond the hedge. Pedestrians stood in little conversational bunches. Others peered into shop windows on the pedestrian strip or glanced over the hedge to watch us eat. There were the few who pushed through the crowd with set expressions, impatient with the 10-mile-per-hour speed of the slidewalk. Maybe they were watching him. Maybe the room was bugged.
We searched the room thoroughly, Ordaz said. If there had been observational equipment, we would have found it.
It could have been removed.
Ordaz shrugged.
I remembered the spy eyes in Monica Apartments. Someone would have had to physically enter the room to carry a bug out. He could ruin it with the right signal, maybe, but it would surely leave traces. And Owen had had an inside room. No spy eyes.
There's one thing you've left out, I said presently. And what would that be?
My name in Owen's wallet, listed as next of kin. He was directing my attention to the thing I was working on, the Lauren gang.
That is possible.
You can't have it both ways.
Ordaz lowered his fork. I can have it both ways, Mr. Hamilton, but you won't like it.
I'm sure I won't.
Let us incorporate your assumption. Mr. Jennison was contacted by an agent of Lauren, the organ legger, who intended to sell transplant material to Belters. He accepted. The promise of riches was too much for him. A month later, something made him realize what a terrible thing he had done. He decided to die. He went to an ecstasy peddler and had a wire put in his head. Later, before he plugged in the droud, he made one attempt to atone for his crime. He listed you as his next of kin, so that you might guess why he had died, and perhaps so that you could use that knowledge against Lauren.
Ordaz looked at me across the table.
I see that you will never agree. I cannot help that. I can only read the evidence.
Me too. But I knew Owen. He'd never have worked for an organ legger. He'd never have killed himself. And if he had, he'd never have done it that way.
Ordaz didn't answer.
What about fingerprints?
In the apartment? None.
None but Owen's?
Even his were found only on the chairs and end tables. I cursed the man who invented the cleaning robot. Every smooth surface in that apartment was cleaned exactly 45 times during Mr. Jennison's tenancy.
Ordaz went back to his chili. Then try this. Assume for the moment that I'm right. Assume Owen was after Lauren, and Lauren got him. Owen knew he was doing something dangerous. He wouldn't have wanted me to get onto Lauren before he was ready. He wanted the reward for himself. But he might have left me something, just in case. Something in a locker somewhere, an airport or spaceport locker. Evidence. Not under his own name, or mine either, because I'm a known arm, but
some name you both know.
Right. Like Homer Chandrasekhar. Or... Got it. Cubes Forsyth. Owen would have thought that was apt. Cubes is dead.
We will look. You must understand that it will not prove your case.
Sure. Anything you find, Owen could have arranged in a fit of conscience. Screw that. Let me know what you get, I said, and stood up and left. I rode the slidewalk, not caring where it was taking me. It would give me a chance to cool off. Could Ordaz be right? Could he? But the more I dug into Owen's death, the worse it made Owen look. Therefore, Ordaz was wrong. Owen worked for an organ legger? He'd rather have been a donor. Owen getting his kicks from a wall socket? He never even watched Tri-D. Owen kill himself? No. If so, not that way. But even if I could have swallowed all that, Owen Jennison letting me know he's worked with organ leggers? Me, Gil the Arm Hamilton? Let me know that? The slidewalk rolled along, past restaurants and shopping centers and churches and banks. 10 stories below, the hum of cars and scooters drifted faintly up from the vehicular level. The sky was a narrow, vivid slash of blue between black shadows of skyscraper. Let me know that? Never. But Ordaz's strangely inconsistent murderer was no better. I thought of something even Ordaz had missed. Why would Lauren dispose of Owen so elaborately? Owen need only disappear into the organ banks, never to bother Lauren again. The shops were thinning out now, and so were the crowds. The slidewalk narrowed, entered a residential area, and not a very good one. I'd let it carry me a long way. I looked around, trying to decide where I was. And I was 4 blocks from Graham's place. My subconscious had done me a dirty. I wanted to look at Kenneth Graham face to face. The temptation to go on was nearly irresistible, but I fought it off and changed direction at the next disc. A slidewalk intersection is a rotating disc, its rim tangent to 4 slidewalks and moving with the same speed. From the center, you ride up an escalator and over the slidewalks to reach stationary walks along the buildings. I could have caught a cab at the center of the disc, but I still wanted to think, so I just rode halfway around the rim. I could have walked into Graham's shop and gotten away with it. Maybe. I'd have looked hopeless and bored and hesitant, told Graham I wanted an Ecstasy plug, worried loudly about what my wife and friends would say, then changed my mind at the last moment. He'd have let me walk out, knowing I'd be missed. Maybe. But Lauren had to know more about the arms than we knew about him. Some time or other had Graham been shown a hollow of yours truly? Let a known arm walk into his shop and Graham would panic. It wasn't worth the risk. Then damn it, what could I do? Ordaz's inconsistent killer. If we assumed Owen was murdered, we couldn't get away from the other assumptions. The care, the nitpicking detail, and then Owen left alone to pull out the plug and walk away, or to be discovered by a persistent salesman or a burglar, or... No. Ordaz's hypothetical killer, and mine, would have watched Owen like a hawk. For a month. That did it. I stepped off at the next disc and got a taxi. The taxi dropped me on the roof of Monica Apartments. I took an elevator to the lobby. If the manager was surprised to see me, he didn't show it as he gestured me into his office. The office seemed much roomier than the lobby had, possibly because there were things to break the anonymous modern decor. Paintings on the wall, a small black worm track in the rug that must have been caused by a visitor's cigarette, a hollow of Miller and his wife on the wide, nearly empty desk. He waited until I was settled, then leaned forward expectantly. "I'm here on arm business," I said, and passed him my ident. He passed it back without checking it. "I presume it's the same business," he said without cordiality. "Yeah, I'm convinced Owen Jennison must have had visitors while he was here." The manager smiled. "That's ridiculous. Impossible." "Nope, it's not. Your holo cameras take pictures of visitors, but they don't snap the tenants, do they?" "Of course not." "Then Owen could have been visited by any tenant in the building." The manager looked shocked. "No, certainly not. Really, I don't see why you pursue this, Mr. Hamilton. If Mr. Jennison had been found in such a condition, it would have been reported." "I don't think so. Could he have been visited by any tenant in the building?" "No, no. The cameras would have taken a picture of anyone from another floor." "How about someone from the same floor?" Reluctantly, the manager bobbed his head. Yes. As far as the holo cameras are concerned, that's possible, but—" "Then I'd like to ask for pictures of any tenant who lived on the 18th floor during the last 6 weeks. Send them to the Arm Building, Central L.A. Can do?" "Of course. You'll have them within an hour." "Good. Now, something else occurred to me. Suppose a man got out on the 19th floor and walked down to the 18th. He'd be hollowed on the 19th, but not on the 18th, right?" The manager smiled indulgently. "Mr. Hamilton, there are no stairs in this building." "Just the elevators? Isn't that dangerous?" "Not at all. There is a separate self-contained emergency power source for each of the elevators. It's common practice. After all, who would want to walk up 80 stories if the elevator failed?" "Okay, fine. One last point. Could someone tamper with the computer? Could someone make it decide not to take a certain picture, for instance?" "I am not an expert on how to tamper with computers, Mr. Hamilton. Why don't you go straight to the company? Caulfield Brains, Inc." "Okay. What's your model?" "Just a moment." He got up and leafed through a drawer in a filing cabinet. "EQ 144. "Okay." That was all I could do here, and I knew it, and still I didn't have the will to get up. There ought to be something. Finally, Miller cleared his throat. "Will that be all, sir?" "Yes," I said. "No. Can I get into 1809? "I'll see if we've rented it yet." "The police are through with it?" "Certainly." He went back to the filing cabinet. "No, it's still available. I'll take you up. How long will you be?" "I don't know. No more than half an hour. No need to come up." "Very well." He handed me the key and waited for me to leave. I did. The merest flicker of blue light caught my eye as I left the elevator. I would have thought it was my optic nerve, not in the real world, if I hadn't known about the holo cameras. Maybe it was. You don't need laser light to make a holograph, but it does get you clearer pictures. Owen's room was a box. Everything was retracted. There was nothing but the bare walls. I had never seen anything so desolate, unless it was some asteroidal rock too poor to mine, too badly placed to be worth a base. The control panel was just beside the door. I turned on the lights, then touched the master button. Lines appeared, outlined in red and green and blue. A great square on one wall for the bed, most of another wall for the kitchen, various outlines across the floor. Very handy. You wouldn't want a guest to be standing on the table when you expanded it. I'd come here to get the feel of the place, to encourage a hunch, to see if I'd missed anything. Translation, I was playing. Playing, I reached through the control panel to find the circuits. The printed circuitry was too small and too detailed to tell me anything, but I ran imaginary fingertips along a few wires and found that they looped straight to their action points, no detours. No sensors to the outside. You'd have to be in the room to know what was expanded, what retracted. So a supposedly occupied room had had its bed retracted for 6 weeks. But you'd have to be in the room to know it. I pushed buttons to expand the kitchen nook and the reading chair. The wall slid out 8 feet, the floor humped itself and took form. I sat down in the chair and the kitchen nook blocked my view of the door. Nobody could have seen Owen from the hall. If only someone had noticed that Owen wasn't ordering food. That might have saved him. I thought of something else, and it made me look around for the air conditioner. There was a grill at floor level. I felt behind it with my imaginary hand. Some of these apartment air conditioning units go on when the CO2 level hits 0.5%. This one was geared to temperature and manual control. With the other kind, our careful killer could have tapped the air conditioner current to find out if Owen was still alive and present. As it was, 1809 had behaved like an empty room for 6 weeks. I flopped back in the reading chair. If my hypothetical killer had watched Owen, he'd done it with a bug. Unless he'd actually lived on this floor for the 4 or 5 weeks it took Owen to die, there was no other way. Okay, think about a bug. Make it small enough and nobody could find it except the cleaning robot, which would send it straight to the incinerator. You'd have to make it big, so the robot wouldn't get it. No worry about Owen finding it. And then, when you knew Owen was dead, you'd use the self-destruct. But if you burned it to slag, you'd leave a burn hole somewhere. Ordaz would have found it. So, an asbestos pad? You'd want the self-destruct to leave something that the cleaning robot would sweep up. And if you'll believe that, you'll believe anything. It was too chancy. Nobody knows what a cleaning robot will decide is garbage. They're made stupid because it's cheaper, so they're programmed to leave large objects alone. There had to be someone on this floor either to watch Owen himself or to pick up the bug that did the watching. I was betting everything I had on a human watcher. I'd come here mainly to give my intuition a chance. It wasn't working. Owen had spent 6 weeks in this chair, and for at least the last week he'd been dead. Yet I couldn't feel it with him. It was just a chair with 2 end tables. He had left nothing in the room, not even a restless ghost. The call caught me halfway back to headquarters. "You were right," Ordaz told me over the wrist phone. "We have found a locker at Death Valley Port registered to Cubes Forsyth. I am on my way there now. Will you join me?" "I'll meet you there." "Good. I am as eager as you are to see what Owen Jennison left us." I doubted that. The port was something more than 230 miles away, an hour at taxi speeds. It would be a big fare. I typed out a new address on the destination board, then called in at headquarters. An arm agent is fairly free. He doesn't have to justify every little move. There was no question of getting permission to go. At worst, they might disallow the fare on my expense account. "Oh, and there'll be a set of hollows coming in from Monica Apartments," I told the man. "Have the computer check them against known organ-leggers and associates of Lauren." The taxi rose smoothly into the sky and headed east. I watched Tri-D and drank coffee until I ran out of coins for the dispenser. If you go between November and May, when the climate is ideal, Death Valley can be a tourist's paradise. There is the Devil's Golf Course with its fantastic ridges and pinnacles of salt, Zabriskie Point and its weird Badlands topography, the old borax mining sites, and all kinds of strange, rare plants adapted to the heat and the death-dry climate. Yes, Death Valley has many points of interest, and someday I'm going to see them. So far, all I'd seen was the spaceport. But the port was impressive in its own way. The landing field used to be part of a sizable inland sea. It is now a sea of salt. Alternating red and blue concentric circles mark the field for ships dropping from space. And a century's developments in chemical, fission, and fusion reaction motors have left blast pits striped like rainbows by esoteric, often radioactive salts. But mostly, the field retains its ancient glare white. And out across the salt are ships of many sizes and many shapes. Vehicles and machinery dance attendance, and if you're willing to wait, you may see a ship land. It's worth the wait. The port building at the edge of the major salt flat is a pastel green tower set in a wide patch of fluorescent orange concrete. No ship has ever landed on it, yet. The taxi dropped me at the entrance and moved away to join others of its kind, and I stood inhaling the dry, balmy air. 4 months of the year, Death Valley's climate is ideal. 1 August, the Furnace Creek Ranch recorded 134 degrees Fahrenheit shade temperature. A man behind a desk told me that Ordaz had arrived before me. I found him and another officer in a labyrinth of pay lockers, each big enough to hold 2 or 3 suitcases. The locker Ordaz had opened held only a lightweight plastic briefcase.
"He may have taken other lockers," he said.
"Probably not. Belters travel light. Have you tried to open it?"
"Not yet. It is a combination lock. I thought perhaps—"
"Maybe." I squatted to look at it. Funny. I felt no surprise at all. It was as if I'd known all along that Owen's suitcase would be there. And why not? He was bound to try to protect himself somehow. Through me, because I was already involved in the UN side of organ legging. By leaving something in a spaceport locker, because Lauren couldn't find the right locker or get into it if he did, and because I would naturally connect Owen with spaceports. Under Cubes's name, because I'd be looking for that, and Lauren wouldn't. Hindsight is wonderful. The lock had 5 digits. He must have meant me to open it. Let's see. I moved the tumblers to 42217. April 22, 2117, the day Cubes died, stapled suddenly to a plastic partition. The lock clicked open. Ordaz went instantly for the manila folder. More slowly, I picked up 2 glass vials. One was tightly sealed against Earth's air and half full of an incredibly fine dust. So fine was it that it slid about like oil inside the glass. The other vial held a blackened grain of nickel iron, barely big enough to see. Other things were in that case, but the prize was that folder. The story was in there, at least up to a point. Owen must have planned to add to it. A message had been waiting for him in the series mail dump when he returned from his last trip out. Owen must have laughed over parts of that message. Lauren had taken the trouble to assemble a complete dossier of Owen's smuggling activities over the past 8 years. Did he think he could ensure Owen's silence by threatening to turn the dossier over to the Goldskins? Maybe the dossier had given Owen the wrong idea. In any case, he'd decided to contact Lauren and see what developed. Ordinarily, he'd have sent me the entire message and let me try to track it down. I was the expert, after all. But Owen's last trip out had been a disaster. His fusion drive had blown somewhere beyond Jupiter's orbit. No explanation. The safeties had blown his life system capsule free of the explosion, barely. A rescue ship had returned him to Ceres. The fee had nearly broken him. He needed money. Lauren might have known that and counted on it. The reward for information leading to Lauren's capture would have bought him a new ship. He'd landed at Outback Field, following Lauren's instructions. From there, Lauren's men had moved him about a good deal, to London, to Bombay, to Hamburg, Germany. Owen's personal written story ended in Hamburg. How had he reached California? He had not had a chance to say. But in between, he had learned a good deal. There were snatches of detail on Lauren's organization. There was Lauren's full plan for shipping illicit transplant materials to the belt, and for finding and contacting customers. Owen had made suggestions there. Most of them sounded reasonable and would be unworkable in practice. Typically Owen. I could find no sign that he'd overplayed his hand. But, of course, he hadn't known it when he had. And there were hollows, 23 of them, each a member of Lauren's gang. Some of the pictures had markings on the back, others were blank. Owen had been unable to find out where each of them stood in the organization. I leafed through them twice, wondering if one of them could be Lauren himself. Owen had never known.
"It would seem you were right," Ordaz said. "He could not have collected such detail by accident. He must have planned from the beginning to betray the Lauren gang."
"Just as I told you. And he was murdered for it."
"It seems he must have been. What motive could he have had for suicide?"
Ordaz's round, calm face was doing its best to show anger.
"I find I cannot believe in our inconsistent murderer either. You have ruined my digestion, Mr. Hamilton."
I told him my idea about other tenants on Owen's floor. He nodded.
Possibly. This is your department now. Organ-legging is the business of the arms."
"Right." I closed the briefcase and hefted it. "Let's see what the computer can do with these. I'll send you photocopies of everything in here."
"You'll let me know about the other tenants?"
"Of course." I walked into ARM headquarters swinging that precious briefcase, feeling on top of the world. Owen had been murdered. He had died with honor, if not, definitely not, with dignity. Even Ordaz knew it now. Then Jackson Barra, snarling and panting, went by at a dead run. "What's up?" I called after him. Maybe I wanted a chance to brag. I had 23 faces, 23 organ-leggers in my briefcase. Barra slid to a stop beside me.
"Where have you been?"
"Working. Honest. What's the hurry?"
"Remember that pleasure peddler we were watching?
Graham? Kenneth Graham?"
"That's the one. He's dead. We blew it."
And Barra took off. He'd reached the lab by the time I caught up with him. Kenneth Graham's corpse was face up on the operating table. His long, lantern-jawed face was pale and slack, without expression, empty. Machinery was in place above and below his head.
"How you doing?"
Barra demanded.
"Not good," the doctor answered. "Not your fault. You got him into the deep freeze fast enough. It's just that the current—"
He shrugged. I shook Barra's shoulder. "What happened?" Barra was panting a little from his run.
"Something must have leaked. Graham tried to make a run for it. We got him at the airport."
"You could have waited, put someone on the plane with him, flooded the plane with TY4.
Remember the stink the last time we used TY4 on civilians? Damn newscasters."
Barra was shivering. I didn't blame him. Arms and organ-leggers play a funny kind of game. The organ-leggers have to turn their donors in alive, so they're always armed with hypoguns, firing slivers of crystalline anesthetic that melt instantly in the blood. We use the same weapon for somewhat the same reason. A criminal has to be saved for trial, and then for the government hospitals. So no arm ever expects to kill a man. There was a day I learned the truth. A small-time organ-legger named Raphael Hain was trying to reach a call button in his own home. If he'd reached it, all kinds of hell would have broken loose. Hain's men would have hypoed me, and I would have regained consciousness a piece at a time in Hain's organ storage tanks. So I strangled him. The report was in the computer, but only 3 human beings knew about it. One was my immediate superior, Lucas Garner. The other was Julie. So far, he was the only man I'd ever killed. And Graham was Barra's first killing.
"We got him at the airport," Barra said. "He was wearing a hat. I wish I'd noticed that. We might have moved faster. We started to close in on him with hypo guns. He turned and saw us. He reached under his hat, and then he fell."
"Killed himself?"
"Uh-huh."
"How?"
"Look at his head."
I edged closer to the table, trying to stay out of the doctor's way. The doctor was going through the routine of trying to pull information from a dead brain by induction. It wasn't going well. There was a flat, oblong box on top of Graham's head. Black plastic, about half the size of a pack of cards. I touched it and knew at once that it was attached to Graham's skull. A droud. Not a standard type. Too big. Uh-huh. Liquid helium ran up my nerves. There's a battery in it. Right. I often wonder what the vintners buy, etc. A cordless droud. Man, that's what I want for Christmas. Bera twitched all over. Don't say that. Did you know he was a current addict? No. We were afraid to bug his home. He might have found it and been tipped. Take another look at that thing. The shape was wrong, I thought. The black plastic case had been half melted. Heat, I mused. Oh. Uh-huh. He blew the whole battery at once. Sent the whole killing charge right through his brain, right through the pleasure center of his brain. And Jesus, Gil, the thing I keep wondering is, what did it feel like? Gil, what could it possibly have felt like? I thumped him across the shoulders in lieu of giving him an intelligent answer. He'd be a long time wondering. Here was the man who had put the wire in Owen's head. Had his death been momentary hell, or all the delights of paradise in one singing jolt? Hell, I hoped, but I didn't believe it. At least Kenneth Graham wasn't somewhere else in the world, getting a new face and new retinas and new fingertips from Lauren's illicit organ banks. Nothing, the doctor said. His brain's too badly burned. There's just nothing there that isn't too scrambled to make sense. Keep trying, Bera said. I left quietly. Maybe later I'd buy Bera a drink. He seemed to need it. Bera was one of those with empathy. I knew that he could almost feel that awful surge of ecstasy and defeat as Kenneth Graham left the world behind. The hollows from Monica Apartments had arrived hours ago. Miller had picked not only the tenants who had occupied the 18th floor during the past 6 weeks, but tenants from the 19th and 17th floors, too. It seemed an embarrassment of riches. I toyed with the idea of someone from the 19th floor dropping over his balcony to the 18th every day for 5 weeks, but 1809 hadn't had an outside wall, let alone a window, not to mention a balcony. Had Miller played with the same idea? Nonsense. He didn't even know the problem. He'd just overkilled with the hollows to show how cooperative he was. None of the tenants during the period in question matched known or suspected Lauren men. I said a few appropriate words and went for coffee. Then I remembered the 23 possible Lauren men in Owen's briefcase. I'd left them with the programmer since I wasn't quite sure how to get them into the computer myself. He ought to be finished by now. I called down. He was. I persuaded the computer to compare them with the hollows from Monica Apartments. Nothing. Nobody matched anybody. I spent the next 2 hours writing up the Owen Jennison case. A programmer would have to translate it for the machine. I wasn't that good yet. We were back with Ordaz's inconsistent killer. That and a tangle of dead ends. Owen's death had brought us a handful of new pictures. Pictures which might even be obsolete by now. Organ-leggers changed their faces at the drop of a hat. I finished the case outline, sent it down to a programmer, and called Julie. I wouldn't need her protection now. Julie had left for home. I started to call Taffy, stopped with her number half-dialed. There are times not to make a phone call. I needed to sulk. I needed a cave to be alone in. My expression would probably have broken a phone screen. Why inflict it on an innocent girl? I left for home. It was dark when I reached the street. I rode the pedestrian bridge across the slidewalks, waited for a taxi at the intersection disc. Presently one dropped, the white free sign blinking on its belly. I stepped in and deposited my credit card. Owen had collected his hollows from all over the Eurasian continent. Most of them, if not all, had been Lauren's foreign agents. Why had I expected to find them in Los Angeles? The taxi rose into the white night sky. City lights turned the cloud cover into a flat white dome. We penetrated the clouds and stayed there. The taxi autopilot didn't care if I had a view or not. So what did I have now? Someone among dozens of tenants was a Lauren man. That, or Ardaz's inconsistent killer, the careful one, had left Owen to die for 5 weeks alone and unsupervised. Was the inconsistent killer so unbelievable? He was, after all, my own hypothetical Lauren. And Lauren had committed murder, the ultimate crime. He'd murdered routinely, over and over, with fabulous profits. The arms hadn't been able to touch him. Wasn't it about time he started getting careless? Like Graham. How long had Graham been selecting donors among his customers, choosing a few non-entities a year? And then twice within a few months, he took clients who were missed. Careless. Most criminals are not too bright. Lauren had brains enough, but the men on his payroll would be about average. Lauren would deal with the stupid ones, the ones who turned to crime because they didn't have enough sense to make it in real life. If a man like Lauren got careless, this was how it would happen. Unconsciously, he would judge arm intelligence by his own men. Seduced by an ingenious plan for murder, he might ignore the single loophole and go through with it. With Graham to advise him, he knew more about current addiction than we did, perhaps enough to trust the effects of current addiction on Owen. Then Owen's killers had delivered him to his apartment and never seen him again. It was a small gamble Lauren had taken, and it had paid off this time. Next time, he'd grow more careless. One day we'd get him. The taxi settled out of the traffic pattern, touched down on the roof of my apartment building in the Hollywood Hills. I got out and moved toward the elevators. An elevator opened. Someone stepped out. Something warned me, something about the way he moved. I turned, quick drawing from the shoulder. The taxi might have made good cover, if it hadn't been already rising. Other figures had stepped from the shadows. I think I got a couple before something stung my cheek. Mercy bullets, slivers of crystalline anesthetics melting in my bloodstream. My head spun, and the roof spun, and the centrifugal force dropped me limply to the roof. Shadows loomed above me, then receded to infinity. Fingers on my scalp shocked me awake. I woke standing upright, bound like a mummy in soft, swaddling bandages. I couldn't so much as twitch a muscle below my neck. By the time I knew that much, it was too late. The man behind me had finished removing electrodes from my head and stepped into view, out of reach of my imaginary arm. There was something of the bird about him. He was tall and slender, small-boned, and his triangular face reached a point at the chin. His wild, silken blonde hair had withdrawn from his temples, leaving a sharp widow's peak. He wore impeccably tailored wool street shorts in orange and brown stripes. Smiling brightly, with his arms folded and his head cocked to one side, he stood waiting for me to speak. And I recognized him. Owen had taken a hollow of him somewhere. "Where am I?" I groaned, trying to sound groggy. "What time is it?" "Time? It's already morning," my captor said. "As for where you are, I'll let you wonder." Something about his manner. I took a guess and said, "Lauren?" Lauren bowed, not overdoing it. "And you are Gilbert Hamilton of the United Nations Police. Gil the Arm." Had he said arm or arm? I let it pass. I seemed to have slipped. "You underestimated the reach of my own arm. You also underestimated my interest." I had. It isn't much harder to capture an arm than any other citizen if you catch him off guard, and if you're willing to risk the men. In this case, his risk had cost him nothing. Cops use hypo guns for the same reason organ leggers do. The men I'd shot, if I'd hit anyone in those few seconds of battle, would have come around long ago. Lauren must have set me up in these bandages, then left me under Russian sleep until he was ready to talk to me. The electrodes were the Russian sleep. One goes on each eyelid, one on the nape of the neck. A small current goes through the brain, putting you right to sleep. You get a full night's sleep in an hour. If it's not turned off, you can sleep forever. So this was Lauren. He stood watching me with his head cocked to one side, bird-like, with his arms folded, One hand held a hypo gun, rather negligently, I thought. What time was it? I didn't dare ask again because Loren might guess something. But if I could stall him until 09:45, Julie could send help. She could send help where? Finagle in hysterics, where was I? If I didn't know that, Julie wouldn't know either. And Loren intended me for the organ banks. One crystalline sliver would knock me out without harming any of the delicate, infinitely various parts that made me Gil Hamilton. Then Loren's doctors would take me apart. In government operating rooms, they flash burn the criminal's brain for later urn burial. God knows what Loren would do with my brain. But the rest of me was young and healthy. Even considering Loren's overhead, I was worth more than 1,000,000 UN marks on the hoof. Why me? I asked. It was me you wanted, not just any arm. Why the interest in me?
It was you who were investigating the case of Owen Jennison. Much too thoroughly.
Not thoroughly enough, damn it. Loren looked puzzled.
You really don't understand?
I really don't.
I find that highly interesting,
Loren mused.
Highly.
All right. Why am I still alive?
I was curious, Mr. Hamilton. I hoped you'd tell me about your imaginary arm.
So he'd said arm, not arm. I bluffed anyway. My what?
No need for games, Mr. Hamilton. If I think I'm losing, I'll use this.
He wiggled the hypo gun.
You'll never wake up.
Damn. He knew. The only things I could move were my ears and my imaginary arm, and Loren knew all about it. I'd never be able to lure him into reach. Provided that he knew all about it. I had to draw him out. Okay, I said, but I'd like to know how you found out about it. A plant in the arms? Loren chuckled.
I wish it was so. No. We captured one of your men some months ago, quite by accident. When I realized what he was, I induced him to talk shop with me. He was able to tell me something about your remarkable arm. I hope you'll tell me more.
Who was it?
Really, Mr. Hamilton.
Who was it?
Do you really expect me to remember the name of every donor?
Who had gone into Loren's organ banks? Stranger? Acquaintance? Friend? Does the manager of a slaughterhouse remember every slaughtered steer?
So-called psychic powers interest me, Loren said. I remembered you. And then, when I was on the verge of concluding an agreement with your belter friend, Jennison, I remembered something unusual about a crewman he had shipped with. They called you Gil the Arm, didn't they? Prophetic. In port, your drinks came free if you could use your imaginary arm to drink them.
Then damn you. You thought Owen was a plant, did you? Because of me. Me?
Breastbeating will earn you nothing, Mr. Hamilton.
Loren put steel in his voice.
Entertain me, Mr. Hamilton.
I'd been feeling around for anything that might release me from my upright prison. No such luck. I was wrapped like a mummy in bandages too strong to break. All I could feel with my imaginary hand were cloth bandages up to my neck and a bracing rod along my back to hold me upright. Beneath the swathing, I was naked. I'll show you my eldritch powers, I told Loren, if you'll loan me a cigarette. Maybe that would draw him close enough. He knew something about my arm. He knew its reach. He put one single cigarette on the edge of a small table on wheels and slid it up to me. I picked it up and stuck it in my mouth and waited hopefully for him to come light it.
My mistake,
he murmured, and he pulled the table back and repeated the whole thing with a lighted cigarette. No luck. At least I'd gotten my smoke. I pitched the dead one as far as it would go, about 2 feet. I'd have to move slowly with my imaginary hand, otherwise what I'm holding simply slips through my fingers. Loren watched in fascination. A floating, disembodied cigarette obeying my will. His eyes held traces of awe and horror. That was bad. Maybe the cigarette had been a mistake. Some people see psi powers as akin to witchcraft and psychic people as servants of Satan. If Loren feared me, then I was dead.
Interesting, Loren said. How far will it reach?
He knew that. As far as my real arm, of course.
But why? Others can reach much farther. Why not you?
He was clear across the room, a good 10 yards away, sprawled in an armchair. One hand held a drink, the other held the hypo gun. He was superbly relaxed. I wondered if I'd ever see him move from that comfortable chair, much less come within reach. The room was small and bare, with the look of a basement. Loren's chair and a small portable bar were the only other furnishings, unless there were others behind me. A basement could be anywhere in Los Angeles, or out of it. If it was really morning, I could be anywhere on Earth by now. Sure, I said. Others can reach farther than me, but they don't have my strength. It's an imaginary arm, sure enough, and my imagination won't make it 10 feet long. Maybe someone could convince me it was if he tried hard enough. But maybe he'd ruin what belief I have. Then I'd have 2 arms just like everyone else. I'm better off. I let it trail away because Loren was going to take all my damn arms anyway. My cigarette was finished. I pitched it away.
Want a drink?
Sure, if you got a jigger glass. Otherwise I can't lift it. He found me a shot glass and sent it to me on the edge of the rolling table. I was barely strong enough to pick it up. Loren's eyes never left me as I sipped and put it down. The old cigarette lure. Last night I'd used it to pick up a girl. Now it was keeping me alive. Did I really want to leave the world with something gripped tightly in my imaginary fist? Entertaining Loren? Holding his interest until... Where was I? Where? And suddenly I knew. We're at Monica Apartments, I said. Nowhere else.
I knew you'd guess that eventually, Loren smiled. But it's too late. I got to you in time.
Don't be so damn complacent. It was my stupidity, not your luck. I should have smelled it. Owen would never have come here of his own choice. You ordered him here.
And so I did. By then I already knew he was a traitor.
So you sent him here to die. Who was it that checked on him every day to see he'd stayed put? Was it Miller, the manager? He has to be working for you. He's the one who took your holograms out of the computer.
He was the one,
Loren said.
But it wasn't every day. I had a man watching Jennison every second, through a portable camera. We took it out after he was dead.
And then waited a week. Nice touch. The wonder was that it had taken me so long. The atmosphere of the place. What kind of people would live in Monica Apartments? The faceless ones, the ones with no identity, the ones who would surely be missed by nobody. They would stay put in their apartments while Loren checked on them to see that they really did have nobody to miss them. Those who qualified would disappear, and their papers and possessions with them, and their hollows would vanish from the computer. Loren said,
I tried to sell organs to the Belters through your friend Jennison. I know he betrayed me, Hamilton. I want to know how badly.
Badly enough. He'd guess that. We've got detailed plans for setting up an organ bank dispensary in the Belt. It wouldn't have worked anyway, Loren. Belters don't think that way.
No pictures?
No. I didn't want him changing his face.
I was sure he'd left something, Loren said. Otherwise we'd have made him a donor. Much simpler, more profitable, too. I needed the money, Hamilton. Do you know what it costs the organization to let a donor go?
$1 million or so. Why'd you do it?
He'd left something. There was no way to get at it. All we could do was try to keep the arms from looking for it.
Ah, I had it then. When anyone disappears without a trace, the first thing any idiot thinks of is organ leggers.
Naturally. So he couldn't just disappear, could he? The police would go to the arms, the file would go to you, and you'd start looking.
For a spaceport locker.
Oh?
Under the name of Cubes Forsyth.
I knew that name,
Loren said between his teeth.
I should have tried that. You know, after we had him hooked on current, we tried pulling the plug on him to get him to talk. It didn't work. He couldn't concentrate on anything but getting the droud back in his head. We looked high and low.
"I'm going to kill you," I said, and meant every word. Loren cocked his head, frowning.
On the contrary, Mr. Hamilton. Another cigarette?
Yeah. He sent it to me, lighted, on the rolling table. I picked it up, holding it a trifle ostentatiously. Maybe I could focus his attention on it, on his only way to find my imaginary hand. Because if he kept his eyes on the cigarette and I put it in my mouth at a crucial moment, I'd leave my hand free without his noticing. What crucial moment? He was still in the armchair. I had to fight the urge to coax him closer. Any move in that direction would make him suspicious. What time was it? And what was Julie doing? I thought of a night 2 weeks past, remembered dinner on the balcony of the highest restaurant in Los Angeles, just a fraction less than a mile up, a carpet of neon that spread below us to touch the horizon in all directions. Maybe she'd pick it up. She'd be checking on me at 09:45.
You must have made a remarkable spaceman, Loren said. Think of being the only man in the solar system who can adjust a hull antenna without leaving the cabin.
Antennas take a little more muscle than I've got. So he knew I could reach through things, if he'd seen that far. I should have stayed, I told Loren. I wish I were on a mining ship right this minute. All I wanted at the time was 2 good arms.
Pity. Now you have 3. Did it occur to you that using psi powers against men was a form of cheating?
What?
Remember Raphael Hain?
Loren's voice had become uneven. He was angry, and was holding it down with difficulty. Sure. Small-time organ legger in Australia.
Raphael Hain was a friend of mine. I know he had you tied up at one point. Tell me, Mr. Hamilton, if your imaginary hand is as weak as you say, how did you untie the ropes?
I didn't. I couldn't have. Hain used handcuffs. I picked his pocket for the key. With my imaginary hand, of course.
You used psi powers against him. You had no right.
Magic. Anyone who's not psychic himself feels the same way, just a little. A touch of dread, a touch of envy. Loren thought he could handle arms. He'd killed at least one of us. But to send warlocks against him was grossly unfair. That was why he'd let me wake up. Loren wanted to gloat. How many men have captured a warlock? Don't be an idiot, I said. I didn't volunteer to play your silly game, or Hain's either. My rules make you a wholesale murderer. Loren got to his feet. What time was it? And I suddenly realized my time was up. He was in a white rage. His silky blonde hair seemed to stand on end. I looked into the tiny needle hole in the hypo gun. There was nothing I could do. The reach of my TK was the reach of my fingers. I felt all the things I would never feel. The quart of trastine in my blood to keep the water from freezing in my cells, the cold bath of half-frozen alcohol, the scalpels and the tiny, accurate surgical lasers. Most of all, the scalpels. Then my knowledge would die when they threw away my brain. I knew what Loren looked like. I knew about Monica apartments, and who knew how many others of the same kind. I knew where to go to find all the loveliness in Death Valley, and someday I was going to go. What time was it? What time? Loren had raised the hypo gun and was sighting down the stiff length of his arm. Obviously, he thought he was at target practice.
It really is a pity,
he said, and there was only the slightest tremor in his voice.
You should have stayed a spaceman.
What was he waiting for? I can't cringe unless you loosen these bandages, I snapped, and I jabbed what was left of my cigarette at him for emphasis. It jerked out of my grip, and I reached and caught it, and stuck it in my left eye. At another time, I'd have examined the idea a little more closely, but I'd still have done it. Loren already thought of me as his property, as live skin and healthy kidneys and lengths of artery, as parts in Loren's organ banks. I was property worth 1,000,000 UN marks, and I was destroying my eye. Organ-leggers are always hurting for eyes. Anyone who wears glasses could use a new pair, and the organ-leggers themselves are constantly wanting to change retina prints. What I hadn't anticipated was the pain. I'd read somewhere that there are no sensory nerves in the eyeball. Then it was my lids that hurt, terribly. But I had to hold on only for a moment. Loren swore and came for me at a dead run. He knew how terribly weak my imaginary arm was. What could I do with it? He didn't know. He'd never known, though it stared him in the face. He ran at me and slapped at the cigarette. A full swing that half knocked my head off my neck and sent the now dead butt ricocheting off a wall. Panting, snarling, speechless with rage, he stood, within reach. My eye closed like a small, tormented fist. I reached past Loren's gun, through his chest wall, and found his heart, and squeezed. His eyes became very round, his mouth gaped wide open, his larynx bobbed convulsively. There was time to fire the gun. Instead, he clawed at his chest with a half-paralyzed arm. Twice he raked his fingernails across his chest, gaping upward for air that wouldn't come. He thought he was having a heart attack. Then his rolling eyes found my face. My face. I was a one-eyed carnivore snarling with the will to murder. I would have his life if I had to tear the heart out of his chest. How could he help but know? He knew. He fired at the floor and fell. I was sweating and shaking with reaction and disgust. The scars. He was all scars. I'd felt them going in. His heart was a transplant. And the rest of him. He'd looked about 30 from a distance, but this close it was impossible to tell. Parts were younger, parts older. How much of Loren was Loren? What parts had he taken from others? And none of the parts quite matched. He must have been chronically ill, I thought, and the board wouldn't give him the transplants he needed. And one day he'd seen the answer to all his problems. Loren wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. I remembered the way his heart had jumped and wriggled in my imaginary hand, and then suddenly given up. He was lying on his left arm, hiding his watch. I was all alone in an empty room, and I still didn't know what time it was. I never found out. It was hours before Miller finally dared to interrupt his boss. He stuck his round, blank face around the door jamb, saw Loren sprawled at my feet, and darted back with a squeak. A minute later, a hypo gun came around the jamb, followed by a watery blue eye. I felt the sting in my cheek.
"I checked you early,"
Julie said. She settled herself uncomfortably at the foot of the hospital bed.
"Rather, you called me. When I came to work, you weren't there, and I wondered why, and wham. It was bad, wasn't it?"
"Pretty bad," I said.
"I've never sensed anyone so scared."
"Well, don't tell anyone about it." I hit the switch to raise the bed to the sitting position. I've got an image to maintain. My eye and the socket around it were bandaged and numb. There was no pain, but the numbness was obtrusive, a reminder of two dead men who had become part of me. One arm, one eye. If Julie was feeling that with me, then small wonder if she was nervous. She was. She kept shifting and twisting on the bed. I kept wondering what time it was. What time was it?
"About 9:10.
Julie shivered.
"I thought I'd faint when that vague little man pointed his hypo gun around the corner. Oh, don't. Don't, Gil. It's over."
That close? Was it that close? "Look," I said, "you go back to work. I appreciate the sick call, but this isn't doing either of us any good. If we keep it up, we'll both wind up in a state of permanent terror." She nodded jerkily and got up. "Thanks for coming. Thanks for saving my life, too."
Julie smiled from the doorway. "Thanks for the orchids."
I hadn't ordered them yet. I flagged down a nurse and got her to tell me that I could leave tonight, after dinner, provided that I went straight home to bed. She brought me a phone, and I used it to order the orchids. Afterward, I dropped the bed back and lay there a while. It was nice being alive. I began to remember promises I had made, promises I might never have kept. Perhaps it was time to keep a few. I called down to surveillance and got Jackson Barra. After letting him drag from me the story of my heroism, I invited him up to the infirmary for a drink. His bottle, but I'd pay. He didn't like that part, but I bullied him into it. I had dialed half of Taffy's number before, as I had last night. I changed my mind. My wrist phone was on the bedside table. No pictures.
"'Lo."
"Taffy? This is Gil. Can you get a weekend free?"
"Sure. Starting Friday?"
"Good."
"Come for me at 10. Did you ever find out about your friend?"
"Yeah. I was right. Organ leggers killed him. It's over now. We got the guy in charge. I didn't mention the eye. By Friday, the bandages would be off. About that weekend, how would you like to see Death Valley?"
"You're kidding, right?"
"I'm kidding wrong. Listen."
"But it's hot. It's dry. It's as dead as the moon. You did say Death Valley, didn't you?"
"It's not hot this month. Listen." And she did listen. She listened long enough to be convinced.
"I've been thinking," she said then. "If we're going to see a lot of each other, we'd better make a bargain. No shop talk. All right?"
"A good idea."
"The point is, I work in a hospital," Taffy said. "Surgery. To me, organic transplant material is just the tools of my trade. Tools to use in healing. It took me a long time to get that way. I don't want to know where the stuff comes from. And I don't want to know anything about organ leggers."
"Okay. We've got a covenant. See you at 1000 Friday." A doctor, I thought afterward. Well, the weekend was going to be a good one. Surprising people are always the ones most worth knowing. Barra came in with a pint of J&B.
"My treat," he said. "No use arguing, 'cause you can't reach your wallet anyway."
And the fight was on.